and the most outstanding musical talent he had ever heard. He was interested in my vocal well-being, but nothing more. Bishop Leonard concurred, saying he heard me sing 6 or 7 years ago, and it was stupendous. No one could believe such a beautiful, mature sound could come from one so young. Another bishop asked what I was doing now. I answered, saying I was a graduate voice student on full scholarship at the New England College of Musical Arts in Boston, and would also sing with the Boston Philharmonic Symphony this summer at the prestigious Music Festival of the Berkshires in Massachusetts. Bishop Wells said that was a significant accomplishment, and I was to be congratulated for it. He added, "Black people don't know how difficult it is to get into such a top-flight music place as that, so I must be an exceptional talent." There was a chorus of amens from the bishops. Stephen told them I was also quite brainy and well-versed in numerous areas of academic study. He continued, "All that being said, the most illustrious thing about me was my dedication to God." He emphasized I could have turned my back on my Christian upbringing, but instead I brought it with me to the most prominent music venues in this country. He related how my singing at the NABA Spring Formal Banquet had electrified the audience, and my rendition of Blessed Assurance at the luncheon for his retired housekeeper brought God directly to the event. Then a bishop introduced himself to me as Bishop Waterton and asked Stephen when and how he knew Ms. LanYe was his chosen partner, noting all this had happened only days ago. Stephen told him how he felt during my singing at the banquet and how we locked eyes afterwards several times. Stephen said he knew he had fallen in love. He also told them he was worried about our age difference and would it seem ridiculous for him to pursue me. That is why he fervently talked to God in his garden to get his permission. He said the whole thing was God's doing. I interjected, I hadn't thought of Bishop Scottsdale much during my music school days because I was busy carrying out my voice career. I certainly did not have an elaborate scheme to hook the bishop. In fact, I seriously doubted he would ever think of me romantically. I pointed out that my supreme confidence on the stage did not transfer to personal confidence off the stage. When it came to men, I was apprehensive and cautious. Frankly, I did not trust men because they always seemed to be chasing women. Plus, their ultimate sexual goals disturbed me. There was a strange silence in the room after that statement. Bishop Scottsdale is the first man in which I have trusted enough and felt free enough to embark upon a personal relationship. He treats women with respect. Therefore, all of those deep, loving feelings I had for him caught me off guard and sent me reeling. A few years ago, I asked my mother when I would know I was in love. She told me it was indescribable, but I'd feel it deep, deep inside, like nothing before. I said strongly to the bishops, I feel that way right now. Without hesitation, Stephen spoke up, saying he had been very lonely and riddled with guilt about the tragic death of his beloved wife, Violet. He thought he would remain in that state of mind until God released him and put love for me in his heart. He stressed, although he yearned for personal love, no woman had caught his attention. He tormented himself for years. Pertinent to everything was his determination to see me the day after the banquet. So much so until he devised a way to use my talent at the luncheon. He goes on by saying he didn't need music at the luncheon, but he needed me. Another bishop interrupted him by saying he never knew Bishop Scottsdale was so tormented. He had covered his feelings for many years, adding, one never knows what goes on inside of us. He said sincerely, we bishops need to be more concerned about each other and more brotherly toward each other. There is no sense in the world that Bishop Scottsdale had to cover up his pain all these years. Who comforted, consoled, and counseled him when he struggled? We tackle the problems of the world, yet we ignore ourselves. What good are we to others if we are ailing? He then stood and proclaimed emphatically that the commission of bishops be brotherly accountable to each other. We are disciples of Jesus who must function as such. Bishop Wells said Bishop Scottsdale called him a week ago and told him of his engagement. He noted that he wanted his personal okay. He relayed, although I was young, I was nonetheless an adult, and for him to stop fretting over the age difference. If we loved each other and had God's permission, then he and the other bishops would follow God's lead. Bishop Wells then asked me to speak. I began by saying how much I respected the commission of bishops. I always viewed them as chosen messengers sitting at the right hand of God. I retold the fact that Bishop Scottsdale was my bishop in my teens. He represented everything a man of the cloth should be. I admired his courage, his strength, and his dedication to do the will of God. He was always personable, polite, and willing to listen. He had patience with those who were in difficult situations again and again, and tried to steer them right. He took time to talk to the youth. He was smart, well-educated, and cultured. I put him on a pedestal, and he never let me down. What was there not to like about this man? But it was 9 days ago that I felt totally in love with him. I need him, and he needs me. Even my wise mother realized God put us together in spite of the hurdles we will face. I know I have never loved anyone so profoundly in my life. Please remember, Bishop Scottsdale married at a very tender age, and that marriage was a strong and lasting marriage. He loved his dear wife, Violet, and his children with all his heart. I will always honor her. That being said and understood, the baton has been passed to me. I respectfully take it and treasure it. I love Bishop Stephen Gilbert Scottsdale with every fiber in my body. We proudly wear our engagement rings as a symbol of our love. I thank the Almighty for choosing him for me and me for him. We are blessed to have each other, and I hope we have the Commission's blessing for marriage. The Commission was moved by the entire proceedings. Bishop Wells asked for the commission's unanimous approval and got it immediately. The bishops applauded loudly and said multiple amens. He then told them to mark Saturday, June 15, 1968, on their calendars, for they should be in attendance at the wedding at First Motherland Congregation AAMU Church in New York City. He remarked, "It is an awesome sight to see the commission of bishops process down the aisle before the wedding party." Bishop Wells then declared the special bishops' meeting closed, asked everyone to meet in the dining hall for dinner, and delivered the benediction. I was thoroughly relieved and quite pleased with the outcome. I took Stephen's arm and proceeded to the dining hall. It occurred to me I had not eaten all day, so I welcomed dinner. Stephen told me I won them over with my honesty and firm deliverance, but added they really needed to know where he stood and whether we were solid in our love. He knew they had to feel certain this was not a passing fancy. One by one, each bishop gave us their blessing. I could tell how highly regarded Stephen was with all of them. Mr. Witherspoon and 4 other drivers joined us. I told him everything went well. He commented, "You had no problem because the truth about your love and the depth of your love shines brightly." After a nice fish dinner, most of the bishops departed. Only 5 bishops, including Stephen, would spend the night. Again, Stephen was visibly fatigued. He gave me a brief overview explaining why he was drained. He brought something to the attention of the bishops that made a point crucial for the continuation of their involvement in the civil rights struggle. They had brisk discussions as to how to accomplish things in a Christian, non-confrontational manner, so as not to put the lives of the church members at risk. It involved the Klansmen racial hate group. Just hearing that name of that group frightened me. I understood why Stephen was so bushed. Even so, being the responsible man, he called my parents to let them know I would be with him in Pittsburgh and would be needed for introductions to his grown children Saturday at his home in D.C. He admitted it would be a difficult task, but he was in prayer and knew somehow all 4 of them will see why he loves me. He would also break the news to his church on Sunday morning. He assured Mama he would take good care of me and that I had my own bedroom in his home, eventually to be our home. He explained further my plans to call them next week to tell them the exact time for my return to Youngstown. He added, being engaged to him calls for a whole lot of a whole lot. Mama told him she understood. The informative and productive conversation gently ended. Since we planned to leave at 9 a.m., the next morning, which was 10 a.m. Eastern Time, for a 6 p.m. meeting in Pittsburgh with the circuit elder of Western Pennsylvania, we all needed to get to bed early. I said farewell to Stephen with a little hug. Mr. W. drove me back to the Arts Club. Mr. Witherspoon and Stephen picked me up at 8:45 a.m. Stephen greeted me with a kiss and asked if I had ever been on such a tight schedule before. Indeed not, I answered. Because he needed to go over some papers pertaining to the evening's meeting, I sat up front to allow him space to work in the back seat. He got right to it. I admired the way he took care of business. I also think he noticed how I was always punctual and never hassled him about his work. Mr. W. and I kept quiet to not disturb Stephen. We stopped around 1 p.m. for gas, a restroom break, and some snacks. We returned to the car and continued on our journey. Stephen was deep in thought. Unexpectedly, he blurted loudly, "Johanna, I love you." I turned around and told him I loved him too. Mr. W. smiled and suggested the bishop needed the warmth I could provide. Stephen gave a hearty yes and asked me to sit with him. We pulled over and I got in the back seat. Somehow, he got a burst of energy and directed it to me. I didn't expect him to be so mushy, but he was. I asked if he finished his work. He said he had, but needed a love tune-up. Frankly, I didn't know what came over him, but I was eager to oblige. We cuddled tightly and rubbed noses. Joshing with us, Mr. W. said he didn't know we were Eskimos. Stephen replied, "Why, yes, it is his heritage." He nibbled on my ear and kissed my neck. I wittingly retorted, "Let's hear it for the Eskimos." He said yes and rubbed noses again. Mr. W. asked what brand of snack he had eaten because he wanted the same one when we returned to D.C. Seeing us smooch made him miss his wife. He told us how he met his wife, Marlis. She was a librarian who enforced the rules about being quiet in the library. Mr. W. frequented the library, but sometimes spoke a bit too loud when talking to her. He did that on purpose, so she would talk to him. Finally, he got up the nerve to ask her out. She said she would go out with him if he promised to speak softly. He said that required him to whisper sweet nothings in her ear all evening. He boasted, "I charmed her right into my arms." After some time dating, she confessed she needled him to get his attention. She liked him the first moment she saw him. They had a wonderful courtship, adding even their parents liked each other. He knew she was the woman for him. He recapped his wedding day and praised the way the bishop officiated. Stephen leaned forward, put his hand on Mr. W.'s shoulder, and told him he was a good man whom he considered to be his brother. He elaborated by saying, although he had no blood brothers, he was abundantly blessed to have two spiritual brothers, Norman Paul, his older brother, and Maurice Witherspoon, his younger brother. Stephen sighed and told us there was too much racial tension in our country, and he felt something horrific would happen within the year. His work at the National NABA office was increasing because factions of white supremacist groups were creating disturbances in the South. He continued by also making us aware of some northern ugliness found in a few Chicago suburbs, adding that is why the bishops met in Chicago. NABA has to stay on top of situations to be an effective organization. We had a lot of negotiating which never reaches the newspapers. Furthermore, we constantly lobby legislators and other government officials. Sometimes we don't know how much good comes from all the work, but our presence certainly works on their collective consciousness. Stephen seemed burdened by everything. He could use some time off, even a vacation. At that moment, I realized I was chosen to be his stress reliever. We were meant to be each other's keeper. I wanted to make myself available to him in ways he had never experienced. I laid my head on his shoulder and rubbed his arms. He admitted his need for affection and thanked me for being there for him. There was a period of silence as we caressed each other's hands. Mr. W. broke the silence by admitting he was hungry. Stephen asked how much farther we had to go because the church would have dinner ready by 5 p.m. Mr. W. howled, "Yippee! We should be there by 5:15, depending on Pittsburgh's rush hour and tunnel traffic." He emphasized his displeasure for driving in Pittsburgh because it is so hilly and easy to get lost. Luckily, he had been to the church before, but it had been a while ago. Before long, we were sitting in a traffic jam in a tunnel. Mr. W. exclaimed, "See, what did I tell you? Driving here is a nightmare." Regardless, Mr. W. got us to Messiah AAMU Church at 5:21 p.m. The kitchen club members, male and female, welcomed us and served a very tasty meatloaf dinner. They were very friendly and catered to Stephen. I heard, "Bishop, may I get anything for you and your staff?" numerous times. Finally, Stephen called 2 of them over and introduced Mr. Witherspoon as his driver, and taking my hand, me as his new fiancée. The startled looks on their faces was worth the trip. They stumbled over themselves trying to say the right words. One lady mustered up enough courage to ask the length of our engagement. Looking at his watch, Stephen answered, 10 days, 3 hours, and 17 minutes of romantic euphoria. I extended my hand so she would see my engagement ring and introduced myself by name to her. Still looking stunned, she said politely, "Pleased to meet you, Miss LanYe, and congratulations." I thanked her graciously. She served us bowls of rice pudding and asked if I'd like anything else. I told her only a glass of water. Without delay, the word had gotten around in the kitchen about Bishop Scottsdale's engagement to the very young woman. I kept smiling, being friendly, charming, and hospitable. Stephen introduced me to the pastor of the church, Reverend Cleotis Benson, and Circuit Elder Jerome Edwards. They were equally shocked to hear of Bishop Scottsdale's engagement. There was a buzz in the Marian Night Chapel, where the meeting would be held instead of the large main sanctuary. I sat at the end of the pew about halfway back. Some members turned around to take a peek at me. It amused me, seeing them all a-tither. Reverend Benson began with a prayer and called the meeting of the biannual Western Pennsylvania Regional Assembly to order. He ardently introduced Reverend Jerome Edwards, the circuit elder for Western Pennsylvania, and excitedly introduced Bishop Scottsdale, emphasizing how awe-inspiring it was to have the bishop in attendance at Messiah AAMU Church. Circuit Elder Edwards began itemizing the work list. Much of it had to do with finances. On the positive side, there appeared to be a membership increase in the 4th Registered District. But the negative side outweighed that increase because the overall assigned offerings and assessment numbers had fallen. The 2 circuit elders, one representing Western New York and Western Pennsylvania, and one representing Northeast Ohio and Central Ohio, all known as the 4th Registered District, over which Bishop presided, recommended ways of enforcing the financial responsibility of all churches in the district. Both recommendations had merit, but lacked a method to convince every member to pay, slight of downright embarrassing them publicly. That would be harsh and definitely heartless, let alone unchristian. Stephen then stood up and spoke to all in attendance. Church, the past 2 days I have been in session with the Commission of Bishops in Chicago. We leaders of the AAMU Church are deeply concerned about us on many fronts. We are tackling serious issues and trying to resolve problems. So I am already in high gear for this 4th Registered District Biannual Western Pennsylvania Regional Assembly. As I listened to your reports, I became keenly aware of your good intentions, particularly regarding the financial foundation of the church. It is indeed serious and extremely important for the continuance of our denomination. I am, however, troubled with our procedures. We are a Christian church. We follow Jesus as an example of how to live our lives. We follow the teachings of Jesus. We invite those who want to fellowship with God to join us as we walk with Him along this bumpy trail. I am sure if the emphasis were more directed toward compassion, warmth, personal care, genuine friendship, valuing every person, and allowing them to feel their worth, the church budget would, more or less, take care of itself. He paused and looked around. Aha, he said, from the looks on your faces, you doubt this would work. Tell me, children of God, does anyone like being strong-armed or threatened? Of course not. That sounds like the way we are forced to pay taxes. Again, I stress we are a Christian church, not a business or the government. We must straighten our priorities. Think of it this way. When we like someone, we gladly do whatever it takes to make them happy, including monetary support. Accordingly, I suggest you reach out with love to all people in attendance on any given Sunday, regardless if they are members or not. Go the extra mile. Don't embarrass them when they can't put money in the offering plate. Talk to folks, not at folks. And don't talk down to anyone. You'd be surprised how that will have a resounding positive effect, which will translate to the overall spiritual and financial health of the church. Pay attention to those around you and always have your actions come from your heart. If we extend our hand of friendship to others, we will reap the benefits. But don't do it only to reap the benefits, because God sees right through a phony. Now, take those reports and insert the word encourage when applicable. Make sure the members comprehend the reasons money is needed for the running of the individual church and the entire church denomination. Ask the preacher deputies to treat each member humanely when they make their home visits. Begin by getting a sense of where they are spiritually. Allow them to ask questions. Let them know you are there for them. If their finances are problematic, assure them, no matter how strained their budgets, they will remain members and are valuable to the church and to God. If they need employment, assist them in acquiring a job. Offer suggestions which may remedy their budgetary anxiety. Like the kids say, be real. Tithing, 1/10 of one's earnings, is a solution for some people, while others may not quite be at that juncture. Nevertheless, share biblical stories about tithing, which may help put this method in perspective. The carefully chosen church treasurer, who is bound by the rules of that office, is to be made aware of every member's ability to pay church dues and assessments. When necessary, the treasurer may consult with any member privately. Nothing about anyone's finances will ever be disclosed. Have the treasurer write thank you notes to all, whether they paid in full or with a promissory note. Do not publicize or distribute budget reports with individual names anywhere, nor insert them inside the Sunday church bulletin. A budget report in the Sunday bulletin is not the proper place for specific church business. Church bulletins should give the order of service, the history of that particular church, and the AANU denomination announcements about parishioners' recent accomplishments, upcoming church events, a list of those who are hospitalized, or shut in at home, and notice of weddings, births, or funerals. Make non-intrusive budget reports available with supplementary church news leaflets and other appropriate flyers on a table in the church entryway or vestibule. All that being said, never make money the main focus. Make the members' spiritual health and growth the main focus. He concluded, I am expected to visit every church in my 4th registered district at least once every 2 to 3 years. I endeavor to give them my personal attention by carefully listening to their concerns and assisting in settling their dilemmas. I relish the thought of having my flock reach goals in accordance with God. In order for every church to meet their mark, I must nurture them, love them, and praise them for their effort. All of us must nurture, love, and praise our membership, compassionately build self-esteem, and put each person in the hand of God. That sums up our path and mission in the African American Methodist Union Church. Stephen sat down. Circuit Elder Edwards responded to the bishop's suggestions by asking for a vote to formally authorize them. He also recognized the role the bishop plays in the running of the church. He likened this meeting to having a prophet guide the church down the right path. They voted to adopt the suggestions and to initiate them immediately. Next, Circuit Elder Edwards asked if there was any new business. One church officer stood and reminded the attendees about the upcoming Sunday School Youth Conference in Rochester, New York. She emphasized the fact that we must lead our youth down the straight and narrow, and pointed out that the church should provide the youth with a child-friendly atmosphere. Being like Jesus ought to be in style. The Sunday School Youth Conference will kick it up a few notches to entice the kids to follow a good path in life. She concluded by suggesting having a youth member participate in every committee in the church. They will feel important to the structure of the church and then most likely carry this forward, thus assuring informed leadership for the future. Having responsibility helps them to develop character as well. Remember, they are our future. Circuit Elder Edwards agreed with the lady and said he has a Sunday School Youth Committee which reports to him regularly. He asked to convey to the churches that adult volunteers are needed to be overseers and chaperones at the conference. Reverend Edwards asked if there was any other business. There was silence. Stephen then stood and asked to make an announcement. He took a few steps, looked at the attendees, and told them he had fallen in love and was engaged to be married. He added it all happened recently and his head was spinning from all the excitement. He walked right up to me in the pew, asked me to stand, and introduced me to everyone. He said, "You know, God is good when he brings love to me at this stage of my life." He put his arm around me and said he was extremely happy and loved me so much until he was giddy. He continued telling them I was an opera singer with a gorgeous lyric soprano voice. He ended by saying I was gorgeous through and through. I didn't say anything, but I smiled continuously. He then invited all of them to our wedding scheduled next June. They applauded the announcement. Reverend Benson remarked, "That's why Bishop looks so good. He's glowing with love." He congratulated us and wished us the very best. He then called the meeting closed and prayed a lovely closing prayer, which enveloped all of the concerns of the meeting and ended with God holding the bishop and his fiancée in his hands. The officers gathered around me to offer congratulations and best wishes. The ladies noted the bishop had been the apple of many ladies' eyes, but he never showed interest in anyone. Therefore, I must be very special. I told them I was flattered by their observations, but I didn't have anything special except total love and honesty. One lady said with a heavy black intonation, "Honey, he's a hunk." Naturally, I agreed. Then that lady said she couldn't help notice I was young. I replied, "Yes, but I was born an old soul," and added, "The bishop and I balance each other beautifully because age is only a number." They realized I was totally in control of the situation and admitted I was a valuable addition to the AAMU hierarchy. Finally, everyone had left except the pastor, the maintenance man, and Stephen and me. Mr. W. waited for us in the car. Stephen thanked Reverend Benson for hosting a well-run meeting. We then headed for Reverend Benson's house in the suburban countryside. It was easy for Mr. W. to follow Reverend Benson. He didn't have to worry about getting lost. I congratulated Stephen for his right-on speech, deep insight, workable solutions, and reinforced my opinion that he was a remarkable bishop. He thanked me but emphasized the amount of work needed at all levels of the church. I reminded him of my mother's words to do everything one step at a time. Reverend Benson had a huge 6-bedroom renovated house, which had been a barn. He uttered, "I bought it cheap because no one wanted an old barn." It took 3 years to complete. Now it is the showpiece of the area. It was very different and captivating. I asked the Reverend if he designed the house, and he said he had. He noted he had a flair for architecture and design. Also boasted about the amount of hard labor he endured while the renovations were in progress. His wife did all the decorating. Unfortunately, I couldn't meet her because she was away visiting her sister who had just had a baby. Nevertheless, it was an adventure roaming through such a stylish, cavernous structure. The living space had an 18-foot ceiling with a huge floor-to-ceiling stone fireplace. The house had a round kitchen, a wraparound screened-in porch, a family room at the far end of the house with a billiards table and a foosball game in it, 3 bathrooms, a powder room, a 2.5-car garage, and 3 acres of land. It was quite an elaborate house. After touring the house, we all went to bed. We departed early Friday morning and headed for D.C. Reverend Benson had mapped good directions so Mr. W. would have an easy time getting to the Pennsylvania Turnpike. We all seemed rather chipper. I know Mr. W. was eager to see his wife, and Stephen wanted to get back and sleep in his own bed. I, on the other hand, was stepping into new territory. I was about to actually spend some days residing in the bishop's house, where we officially got engaged. All the traveling we had done muffled the fact that I had taken a major step in a direction which would affect the rest of my life. I had gone from a single graduate student to an engaged woman, and not to just some guy, but to a prominent bishop and well-known civil rights activist. The reality hit me mightily. Mr. W. pulled into a filling station and told us he had to use the restroom. When he left, I turned and asked Stephen what he planned to do with me. Looking puzzled, he replied, "Do with you how?" I asked, would I really be in his house while in D.C.? He said soothingly, "Yes, with me in my house. I have 3 bedrooms, and 1 is yours, my love. My house will soon become our house. You are my world, and I need you with me. Johanna, we are engaged to become husband and wife. I truly want you to be comfortable with me. After we are married, I will happily change or arrange the house to suit your taste. Better yet, I'll buy us a new house so we can start fresh." I exclaimed, "Oh, Stephen, I love your home. We proclaimed our love in your beautiful garden. I never want to leave that house. I just wanted to make sure I wouldn't become a liability." Holding me tightly, he retorted, "Johanna, that is ridiculous. I love you so much it hurts. It is essential that you believe me and believe in me. You have me, all of me. I will forever love, protect, and provide for you. You are the only woman for me, my sweet cupcake." I guess I needed reassuring, and Stephen put my anxieties to rest. He was so compassionate. He knew just what to say and just how to say it. Mr. W. returned. We stopped at Old McDonald's for burgers and fries, and then resumed traveling to Washington, D.C. Stephen and I sat holding hands and gazing out of the window. I started thinking about meeting Stephen's children. Coincidentally, Stephen was thinking about them as well. He mentioned how much his oldest daughter, Violetta, resembled his wife, and how that resemblance was troublesome. He always delights in seeing her because he experiences 2 pleasures: a chance to sort of see his wife and marvel at his pretty daughter at the same time. He becomes happy and sad every time he sees her. A few times he has elected to not see her just to avoid the confusion, which of course is not fair to her. Her likeness to her mother is not her fault. To make matters worse, she also acts and moves like Violet. Stephen admitted to strenuously grilling her husband when he was her boyfriend because he did not want him to marry her. Now he is reaping all that because she does not want her father to marry me. Squeezing my hand, he further admitted occasionally slighting his children as he rose in his career. He said he missed certain events which were critical to their advancement in school. His youngest daughter, Zelda, was a cheerleader. His youngest son, Abraham, was an amazing tap dancer and choreographer. His oldest son, Stephen David, was a debating champion, and Violetta played flute in the marching band. Now they were all married. Zeldin is a pediatrician with 3 children. Her husband, Willard, is a banker. Abraham has 2 children and is a co-owner of a small theater. His wife, Flo, is a lead dancer with a highly regarded Warren Wilding dance company. Stephen David followed in his father's footsteps by becoming a pastor and has 3 children. His wife, Connie, is a stay-at-home mom. Violetta and her husband, Dorian, are lawyers and have 1 child. I remembered seeing Stephen David with his little children at the AAMU Sunday School Youth Conference in Columbus, Ohio, when I was a young teen. I tried to comfort Stephen by emphasizing how great they all turned out, Obviously, he and Violet did a good job raising them, in spite of his concerns. No parent is perfect, but he did the best he could, and the results are fantastic. He loves his children and is proud of them. I'm proud of them too. Stephen began sharing some of his background. His father, George Washington Scottsdale, had been a successful landscaper, gardener, florist in the late 1880s. He was one of the most respected black men of that era. He built the building in which his business was housed. People black and white looked up to Mr. Scottsdale. Stephen was his only child. Mr. Scottsdale and wife Louise instilled a huge sense of obedience to God and responsibility to family into Stephen. They were upstanding people with high standards who dressed properly, spoke eloquently, and expected near perfection from Stephen in every aspect of his life. They took Stephen to AAMU church services every Sunday and had a no-nonsense relationship with their son. He was groomed to be the best at whatever he attempted. They were very religious, read the Bible daily, and were the quintessential Victorian couple. Hearing about Stephen's roots allowed me to understand how disciplined he had been in his life. He constantly strove for perfection. Although he was an honor student at every level of his education, his parents were disappointed when he was not valedictorian of his high school class. They viewed his being salutatorian as second best and unacceptable. Therefore, he seldom had the opportunity to experience sheer pleasure and bask in its glory, because his folks viewed emotions as a weakness in one's character. At the next level, he was a top student at the Cofferdon College and learned as much as he could about everything. This was remarkable considering the era in which he was in college. In those days, Negro students admitted to white schools were few and far between. Due to his diligence, he practically lived in the library and never missed a single day of school. He and Violet met in Sunday school. They had an obvious attraction to each other. Stephen promised to marry her when he finished college, as a fine, upstanding young man in that time frame would do. His parents approved of Violet, and her parents. She, too, was an only child. He courted her in a very virtuous manner and was always chaperoned when they went anywhere. Riding in a horse-drawn buggy, Mr. and Mrs. Scottsdale accompanied Stephen and Violet to the park and to the church picnic. They kept a close eye on him at all times. They were so strict until Stephen was almost afraid to touch Violet, even after they married. He set his marriage up according to the moral philosophy about which he was taught. His children had to follow his house rules. He feels guilty for everything that goes wrong around him, including the state of the entire world, but takes no credit for resolving situations which he directly influenced, because that is counterproductive and unnecessary. Since Stephen has been so regimented all his life, God sent me to him to ease his burdens and bring him a sense of contentment. God knows how much I love Stephen. I want him to be engulfed within my love. I want him to love me with abandon, unbridled joy, and frivolity. I want us to bathe ebulliently in our love. We arrived in D.C. right at rush hour, so the traffic had its usual bumper-to-bumper tie-up. Mr. W. wanted to get home because he now had a headache. He dropped us off, switched cars, bid us adieu, and headed home. Stephen and I got our belongings and went inside. Stephen was tired, and I was anxious. It felt strange coming to the bishop's house as his fiancée. I was a bit overwhelmed. Noticing my trepidation, Stephen hugged me from behind and whispered in my ear, "Welcome home, my love." I sank into his arms and replied, "This is such a special house. We were able to soak up the passion that dripped from our pores in this house after we had professed our profound love for each other in the grand garden. We were so full of emotion until we stood in the middle of the kitchen holding each other. I told him his house was sacred to me. We slowly broke the embrace. He led me up the stairs to my bedroom. It was a medium-sized room with a full bed, an ample closet, a rocker, a dresser, a chest, a nightstand, and an attached small bathroom with a shower. It had good vibrations. There were pictures of horses on a ranch and a nighttime view of the White House on the wall. I asked about the horses. Stephen said the ranch is in Delaware and belongs to his good friend Gregory Parker, who extends an open invitation for him to use it as his private oasis. Stephen is fond of horses and bonded with the two pictured, although he never rode them. He spent time talking to them, brushing them, feeding them, and watching them gallop. He said the ranch is his secret getaway spot and promised to take me there. I told Stephen I liked horses too. In fact, my cousin has horses on his farm in Pennsylvania, 15 minutes across the border from Youngstown. There I rode horses whenever we visited his land. This conversation uplifted my psyche and calmed me down considerably. Stephen then showed me his bedroom. It was a large room with a full-size bed, a desk, a dresser, 2 comfy chairs, a chest, a walk-in closet, a nightstand, and a large attached bathroom with a separate tub and shower. There were pictures on the walls of serene places in the woods and a vista of a lovely mountain. I shared with him my fondness for meadows and mountain streams. I told him I wished he had come with my parents to pick me up in Aspen, Colorado 2 years ago when I studied voice at the Colorado Rockies Classical Music Festival for the summer. It was so lovely to have been surrounded by the mountains and practice in the little practice cabins beside mountain streams. He reminded me that if he had shown up with my folks, how strange it would have been at that time. He laughed, saying no one could have explained why he was there. I nudged aside and said, "You know what I mean." He responded, yes. He knew I meant, wouldn't it have been something had we been in love 2 years ago? Recited together, no, you know God knows what's best. And he's always right on time. And speaking of time, it was time for us to go to bed. Tomorrow promised to be a challenging day, facing the Scottsdale clan. We lovingly hugged and kissed and said good night. Sleep tight. I left Stephen's room and went to my room. I got ready for bed and crawled under the covers. It was fairly early, but with some romantic thoughts lurking, I dreamily fell asleep. When I awakened Saturday morning, the sun was shining brightly. I was somewhat disoriented because I had slept on so many different places within a short period of time. I looked around and realized I was in Stephen's house. In seventh heaven, I put my arms around the pillow, mimicking the way I hug Stephen. But all those thoughts disappeared when I was abruptly jolted into the reality of meeting his grown children later in the day. It was 8:12 a.m. I jumped out of bed, went to the bathroom, and took a shower. As I was dressing, I heard Stephen moving about. It was exciting knowing he was just across the hall. Quickly, he went downstairs. I put on my shoes and skedaddled downstairs too. I went into the kitchen and found Stephen looking inside the refrigerator. I squeezed him from behind and greeted him, saying, "Good morning, Pumpkin." He laughed and replied, "Good morning, Cupcake." I asked if he slept well. He replied, "Like a baby." However, it took him a little while to fall asleep because he was thinking about me across the hall. I admitted to also thinking about him being so close, yet so far. But ultimately, those thoughts lulled me into a restful night's sleep. I wanted to know what he was looking for. He answered something to eat and revealed there were only assorted leftovers in the fridge and cereal in the cupboard that we could have for breakfast. Normally, he had his groceries delivered, but because of the power-packed past 2 weeks, the subject of groceries had been forgotten and neglected. I sashayed around him and asked cunningly if he'd rather have a well-stocked refrigerator or me. Tapping his finger to his face, pretending to ponder the question, he responded, "Well, let's see." I playfully gave him a little poke on the arm. "You," hands down. While pinching my cheek, I uttered, "Why, yes, but of course," mimicking a highfalutin type of person. I stated there was quite enough food here to eat, got 2 bowls, put cereal with fruit in them, and poured milk over them. "See, I've cooked breakfast." Amused, Stephen said he had underestimated my high cuisine. I stuck my nose in the air and said, "Oh, oui, I trained with the renowned French chefs." He continued ribbing me by asking if I graduated from Le Cordon Bleu. I said with a faux French accent and with my pinky sticking out, "Naturellement, monsieur, at the top of the class." As I strutted off, he seized me and spun me around like in old movies and said, "Mademoiselle, je t'aime," and kissed my hand. But in the back of my mind, I kept thinking this was D-Day for me and Stephen's grown children. The pit of my stomach housed a bundle of nerves. In a few hours, a judgment would be decided about me that will affect my relationship with Stephen for the rest of our lives. I already knew they disliked me, but did I have what it takes to change their mind? Stephen resumed being frisky in an attempt to override his uneasiness concerning the summit meeting scheduled for the afternoon. But in spite of his action, he divulged being on pins and needles. He informed me we would all meet in the family rec room in the basement. I didn't know there was a family rec room in the house, so he showed me the basement. It was sizable and arranged pleasingly. I was absolutely blown away because there was a ping pong table and I was a table tennis enthusiast. Stephen conveyed the fact that the table had been left there by the previous owners who moved to Europe. It was a first-rate table. I asked if there were paddles. He reached in the pocket on the side of the table and revealed 2 very fine paddles and 3 ping-pong balls. I asked Stephen if he played table tennis. He responded no and elaborated he was not coordinated enough to play any sport. Athletics were not his thing. I owned up to being a pretty good table tennis player and would gladly teach him how to play. Seeming uncomfortable with the subject, he expanded his negativity by declaring he was too old to play anyway. I informed him that people of all ages and various physical conditions could play. Sensing a need to diffuse his unsettled frame of mind, I put a paddle in my hand to demonstrate the most used proper grip. Then I reached around him to show him how to swing the paddle. That action did the trick. He asked me to put my arms around him and show him again. He liked that. It somehow turned into a spicy motion. With a twinkle in my eye, I instructed him to behave himself. He was feeling quite spunky. I did not know table tennis would have such an effect on him, but I liked it a whole lot. I then came up with the idea to order pizzas and soda pop. I thought the casual Saturday afternoon atmosphere would be less threatening. Stephen agreed. I looked up a nearby pizza parlor in the telephone book, called and made the arrangements for delivery. The time passed swiftly. It was 1:05 p.m. I drank a glass of water, and Stephen paced back and forth. After a while, he decided to go upstairs and unlock the front door. At that very moment, someone pulled into the driveway. When that person entered the house, I could hear exuberant greeting. It was his son, Abraham. He came downstairs, introduced himself, and hugged me. He communicated how all four siblings struggled with the idea of their father marrying a much younger woman. Nevertheless, I should rest easier knowing they met on Monday to discuss the matter in depth. Unbeknownst to Stephen, Mr. Witherspoon had called them and relayed our entire touching love story. He told them finally women would stop hounding the bishop because he was in love with the woman God sent to him. The reason Abraham was there early is because he was selected to speak to me first, since he's the artist in the family. Miraculously, at their meeting, they reached an agreement. They were able to take their personal emotion out and put themselves in the shoes of their father. He deserved love and companionship. They realized that a really young woman could energize their father and also be there to aid him in case of any emergency situation. They threw in the fact that their father was a good-looking man whom women of all ages oogled. They came to the conclusion to give me a fair chance and have their kids call me Miss Johanna. One by one, the others arrived, greeted me hospitably, and introduced themselves. They were all quite eye-catching and very intelligent. Violetta truly resembled the picture of her mother upstairs and seemed rather businesslike, yet cordial. Zelda was outgoing and personable. Reverend Stephen David had the typical preacher swagger and speech pattern. We laughed and talked like old friends. They welcomed me to the family. I then sealed my case for being a part of them by making a super suggestion. I expressed my sincere happiness meeting them and emphasized the love I have for their father. I continued by assuring them I would always honor the memory of their mother, Violet. No one could ever take her place. I suggested that they consider instituting a special college prize in her name. For instance, the $500 Violet Adele Baker Scottsdale Prize. The family could decide how they wanted it to run. That way, people could read about her and she would be remembered. It would be a continuous annual family prize from all of you and your children. They really liked that idea. They decided to meet later in the summer to draw up such a plan. It had to be done correctly and sensitively. Violetta volunteered to oversee the project with her husband. I was extremely pleased my idea went over so well. Zelda asked what else I had up my sleeve. I guaranteed her nothing was hiding up my sleeve. But I did want to see I wanted her to see the beautiful engagement ring on my finger below my sleeve. I proudly pointed to their father's finger to reveal his matching ring. Somehow she had missed noticing the ring, but thought they were quite elegant. She wondered when we had had enough time to purchase rings. Stephen answered he had to make it official, so after we picked them, he rushed to have them sized the very afternoon that God saw fit to cause an avalanche of love to come down upon us. Zelda declared everything was in order and called the meeting a good happening. Stephen sat soaking up everything. Finally, he walked over to me, took my hand, and told me he loved me dearly. He further explained to them his need for me in his life. He also noted how grateful he was that Mr. Witherspoon had pleaded the case for our engagement. I gave an impassioned amen to that and amplified my thought that he was our guardian angel. The pizzas arrived. We all ate and chatted warm-heartedly. Stephen hugged his children and told them he loved them beyond belief. He took me in his arms and kissed me rather romantic. They shouted out, "All right, Dad, you've got it going on." Humorously, I told them I can't make him behave. Stephen David said, chuckling, "I'll pray for him." Zelda said I was good for her dad and added, "I seemed a lot older." Then Reverend Stephen David challenged anyone to a game of table tennis. I spoke up saying, "You're on." He said he didn't want to take advantage of me by giving me a ping pong whipping. I said, "We'll see about that." Abraham said he thought he heard a challenge. Reverend Stephen David served the ball, and I immediately told him it was an illegal serve. He asked why. I explained that the ball must leave the hand in full sight of the opponent. One cannot cover the ball in one's hand. He said, "Wait a minute, how do you know all that?" I told him I was the female champ in music conservatory and had worked with the national table tennis champion at his table tennis club in downtown Cleveland. Zelda said, "Stephen David, you better pray for yourself." I then served the ball and he missed. He missed all my serve. I told him I had an unfair advantage, so I would play with my left hand. Even doing it that way, I beat him handily. Violetta said, my. A table tennis playing opera singer. I assured her I couldn't do anything else in the world of sports. Table tennis seemed to be the sport of choice for classical musicians. They asked me if I would teach their children to play. I answered, gladly. Stephen seemed very, very happy to see me interacting with his children. Zelda held him in her arms and told him she loved him and wanted to spend more time with him. Stephen said he wanted that as well. He liked having just the four of them over and thought this should happen at least once a year. Reverend Stephen David said, I forced them into being closer. He decided right then to make getting closer his sermon for tomorrow, although he had another sermon already prepared. He elaborated, sometimes God has other plans. I told him he is upholding the Scottsdale preacher tradition and that it was noble of him to do so. He whispered, I prayed and Dad to be a blessed couple. Somehow he knew I was right for him, even though I was so very young. Eventually the time came for them to depart. We had had a good time. I thanked them again for their votes of confidence and support. But Stephen David thanked me for the wholesome manner in which I loved his father. Just before stepping outside, he jokingly warned me that next time he would really wipe me out in table tennis. I told him why not bring the entire crew over for an afternoon of table tennis and make it a family affair. Stephen and I stood in the doorway waving goodbye to them. He said, the Lord did make a way. Now it is well with my soul. Bubbling over with emotion, he blurted, Johanna, I am sure more than ever the good Lord selected you for me and me for you. I feel like a new man. What a relief it is for us to have the approval of my children. We put our arms around each other, walked to the study, and sat on the love seat. He said he would run the service alone tomorrow because the pastor was out of town. Stephen was the pastor emerita, having served that church for many years in the past. I asked if he had a sermon ready. He answered, yes, the subject is listening to God. He promised I would like it. I told him I always liked his sermons, for they were thought-provoking. I elaborated by saying he was a natural orator. Out of the blue, he began whispering sweet nothings in my ear, telling me he wanted to devour. I acted somewhat flirtatious and asked how he planned to accomplish that feat. It was evident we were feeling our oats. It was also clear we didn't know how to handle such exhilaration. We were alone and craving intimacy. So I suggested I give him a tickle massage because my piano-playing fingers were very sensitive to the needs of the body. Although he did not know exactly what that was, he readily agreed to the massage. Now I faced having to fulfill my suggestion. I asked him to remove his clergy shirt and collar, which revealed his white short-sleeve undershirt. He took off his shoes, but not his socks. He did not remove his pants. I decided to place myself on the floor and have him stretch out face down on the couch. Since it was a small couch, his feet would be on the armrest. I set about slowly and sensuous, touching his neck, shoulders, arms, and when my fingers progressively contacted his body, his breathing rate increased noticeably. Hearing him breathe excited me. I took my time as I savored the parts of his body. I rubbed his back. My hands delicately stroked his thighs, legs, and feet, giving special attention to each toe. I gradually ceased this process and whispered in his he was driving me crazy. He murmured he had never experienced such intense fulfillment from being touched. Uttered, I had started something he was sure to crave forever. In my sultry tone of voice, I told him I enjoyed playing him more than the piano. I shared my belief that people generally bypass this extreme sensuous gratification we can get from touching. He asked if we might do that again soon. Still, with my sultry voice, I gave a resounding yes. He took his time sitting up, looked at me, and told me in a deep, voluptuous tone of voice. I had him hook, line, and sinker. He put on his shoes. I helped him up because he was rather weak from all that titillation. We leisurely went upstairs to get ready for bed and continued commenting on how incredible that experience had been. I put on my jammies and daydreamed a bit. Stephen called me from the highway. Stephen called from the hallway. I ran out, hugged him, and told him no word was powerful enough to express how deeply I loved him. He said he felt exactly the same and asked me never to leave him. I assured him I wanted to be with him forever. We parted and retired for the evening in our room. It was Sunday morning and time for us to go to West Fellowship AAMU Church. I waited for Stephen downstairs and had coffee, juice, and bagel with cream cheese ready for him. When he came down, he was surprised to see the fix. I told him my culinary skills had surfaced once more. I gave him a peck on the cheek so as not to disturb his clothing. He told me he liked my dress and said I looked lovely in it. I replied I was very pleased because it was the same dress I wore 2 years earlier at Christ Memorial Church in Youngstown when we talked briefly outside. He admitted having fleeting feelings for me as we chatted that Sunday, but refused to allow those feelings to surface. Yet he could not get over how much I had changed. He remarked how down deep he wished to be a young man at that moment, so he could have asked me to dine with him. Knowing that was impossible, and feeling that anything he did right that minute would be inappropriate, he dismissed all such thoughts and resorted to being an attentive bishop. I remember how he looked, but thought he was only listening carefully to what I was saying. Mr. Witherspoon arrived looking refreshed. He brought greetings from his wife and said she was anxious to meet him. I told him I likewise wanted to meet her. Together, Stephen and I thanked him for running interference for us with his children. He said he knew we were stressed about facing them, so he wanted to set the record straight. We told him the meeting turned into a family party and they had given me thumbs. He further informed us that Marlis would like to have us over for dinner if we didn't have other plans. Stephen needed to make sure Marlis were and not Marlis setting this up unbeknownst to his Mr. Witherspoon assured they had made arrangements for the visit, if at all possible. And being that dinner wasn't that, but planned for the next day, he thought it might work out because he had not any request from the bishop to go anywhere after church. Stephen truly liked the idea of spending some time with the Witherspoon. He had not seen her much since he married them 10 years ago. I also wanted to meet the woman who won Mr. Witherspoon's heart. We enthusiastically accepted the invitation. We got in the car and proceeded to the church. When we arrived, Witherspoon got out and opened the door for the bishop. Stephen got out and opened the door for me. When I appeared, some church members wondered who I was. However, a small group remembered me from 2 weeks earlier at the NABA banquet and thought I was the guest soloist for the morning service. I smiled and said good morning to them. Stephen extended his arm to me while greeting them. We walked in the church. Stephen introduced me to Circuit Elder LanYe Bradford, who was there to assist the bishop with communion. He seated me on the front pew directly in front of the pulpit and went to the pastor. The church was a very nice Romanesque revival style, fairly large, older structure with pretty stained glass. When some deacons welcomed, then individual members said good morning. Gradually the church began to fill with worship. The organist and pianist began playing inspiration. Shortly the choir marched in singing What a Fellowship, What a Joy Divine, Leaning on the Everlasting. It was a singing church. The entire congregation sang, full-bodied with the choir. Actually, there were two choirs, the young adult choir and the children's choir, called the Cherub. The church was nearly full because those choirs were very popular and drew lots of people. Stephen was singing his heart out. I got a big kick watching him. The other reason there were so many at the church that Sunday was because they knew the bishop was preaching. Stephen was a revered preacher who drew large numbers of people to his church. The combined choirs sang, and they absolutely livened up the entire congregation. Thunderous amens and hallelujahs erupted from the congregation, and the little cherubs just beamed because they knew they had done a good job. Stephen stood and welcomed everybody to the house of the Lord. He said his soul was so happy until he could not sit down, and warned the church that he was highly contagious. He indicated if anyone came close to him, happiness would wrap itself around them and not let go until they were totally infected. He began to preach about listening to God. He asked the congregation if they really when God spoke to them. A few folks shook their heads affirmative, but most just sat still. Nothing affirmatively. He admitted most people didn't know God was speaking. The majority of us hear something in our heads but fail to capitalize on the suggestion. When we hear that voice, we should go into action as soon as. Therefore, the voice you first hear in your head is God talking. Any other voice is the voice of doom. Old doom wants you to fail so he can have control over you. You will doubt yourself when doom rules your mind. You will get angry and lose your temper. You will make groundless accusations against your friend. He paused, walked in front of the lectern, and related his personal struggle listening to God some years ago. He told the church he fell into a deep depression after his wife was killed and could not understand why God took her from him and his children. He thought he had been a faithful servant of God and tried to do what's right. Eventually, however, after much soul search, he realized God was testing his faith. He said he never thanked God enough for providing him with a good wife and family. Plus, he thought his good deeds would help him move up the pastoral career ladder. He had taken God for granted while possessing a huge sense of entitlement, but he got kicked down so hard until it would take true faith to stand up again. The voice of God ordered him to help others unconditionally and from the depth of his heart, and he obeyed. He shed his cloak of clerical royalty and began battling in the trench, giving directly to the people, replacing the expectation of having them make appointment with him in his. By doing so, he was able to truly connect with his flock instead of pompously reigning over them. It was then he became a recognized leader in the fight for justice in this country. It was then he became effective, moving the AAMU church into a better spiritual direction. He paused again, slowly looked around the church, and disclosed he rejoiced when solutions were found for others, but thought he would never find true personal happiness again. However, about 6 weeks ago, God told him to contact a fine lyric soprano to sing at the National Association of Black. However, about 6 weeks ago, God told him to contact fine lyric soprano to sing at the NABA formal banquet. His secretary tracked her down. She was doing graduate work at the New England College of Musical Arts in Boston and was able to perform at the banquet, which pleased him greatly. You see, 6 years ago, this talented young lady had been my designated soprano when I needed a super talent to perform for my 4th registered district special occasion. I had not seen her for 2 years and had not heard her sing for 3 years. He interjected. Some in this church had the privilege of hearing her sing 2 weeks ago and know you heard vocation. Amen, amen, amen was heard throughout the church. Continuing, something happened as she sang. I felt a rush of emotions and actually became a bit lightheaded. It scared me because I was sitting in front of everyone. I lacked an understanding of this condition, but pretended all was well. The voice in my head said I was falling in love. I did not want to listen to that voice. Nevertheless, it was the voice of God speaking. As I began fiddling with things on the table, that voice told me to write a note asking if she could provide music for the retirement luncheon I was having the next day for my housekeeper, Mr. Norman Paul. I wrote the note and had it delivered to her. She wrote back, confirming she could do it. I beamed inside with delight. God was working for me, but not in a traditional way. I was terrified. I am a bishop, for crying out loud, and a much older man. How could this voice tell me something so outrageous? I mulled it over in my head practically all night. The next morning I had a serious talk with God. God assured me all was well, and I should tell her how. When she arrived at his home the next day, he almost jumped out of it. It says, after my guests were situated, played the wonderful hymn, Blessed Assurance, and sang the last verse. It was so moving until everyone got teary-eyed. I knew for sure God was moving mountains for me, because after the luncheon, the two of us found our way to my garden and began a romance. Simply stated, I listened to God and found personal love. As a result, today I am able to proudly announce to Wesley Fellowship Church my engagement to this magnificent young woman and invite the entire church to our wedding next June at Motherland First Congregational AAMU Church in New York City. Regardless of what anyone else thinks, God gave me the okay. Taking it further, we were okayed by her parents, the Council of Bishops at a special meeting in Chicago, and my 4 grown children, all within a span of 2 weeks. Therefore, I want this church to meet the love of my life, my fiancée, Miss Johanna LanYe. I stood up and smiled as the church applauded briskly. After I sat down, Stephen said firmly, "Church, listen to God." A chorus of "Yes, Bishop," and "Amen" rang throughout the church. Stephen sat down. The ushers came forth. The service continued with the offering. The young adult choir sang with a strong 3-beat, "Walk in the light, beautiful light, come where the dewdrop of mercy shine bright, shine all around us by day and by night, Jesus, the light of the world." The ushers brought the offering plates to the altar. The choir sang the doxology, "Praise God from whom all blessings." Stephen rose and blessed the offering. The ushers moved to a designated space to handle the money. It was the first Sunday in June, and as customary in the AAMU church, it was Communion Sunday. Preparations were made for the parishioners to come to the altar. Because there were so many people in attendance, the ritual took quite a while. Many took the opportunity to sneak a peek at me as they walked up to the communion table. Stephen spoke the word of communion. As in the tradition of the AAMU church, the next thing is to ask if anyone has found it in their heart to join the church. 7 people came to Stephen spoke to them in a fairly and wonderful fatherly tone, praising them for making a God-directed decision. He asked them if they were ready to stand tall and to stand with God. He briefly explained the inner workings of the church and told them each will be assigned a preacher deputy who would be their personal advisor to further familiarize them with the church and their Christian obligation. He directed the congregation to stand as he welcomed them into the family of Wesley Fellowship AAMU Church. Subsequently, he delivered the benediction. The organist and pianist played some music which led directly into the recessional. It's a highway to heaven. None can walk up there but the pure in heart. It's a highway to heaven. We are walking up the King's highway. After the extremely long service ended, I was mobbed by church members. They wished me well. Some, on the other hand, just wanted to take a closer look at me and size me up. I didn't mind. It came with the territory. I was scrutinized thoroughly by everybody. Even some children ran by saying I was the bishop's girlfriend. I never thought of it that way, but I guess they were right. The news about the bishop getting engaged seemed to ignite extra energy in the entire congregation. They were also very intrigued about me because I was an opera singer. Some tried to finagle me into telling my age. It goes without saying, I did not fall for their tricks. Instead, I stressed the importance of true love, regardless of age. I showed them my engagement ring. They oohed and awed. A few had noticed the bishop also wore an engagement ring. This went on for at least 25 minutes until Stephen walked up and rescued me. I was happy to bid them adieu. Stephen commented on the unusual liveliness exhibited by his church members. He was not prepared for such an amount of hoopla. Sometimes he forgets he is a major religious and civic leader, not only in Washington, D.C., but also throughout the entire United States. Painstakingly, we maneuvered our way through the crowd and finally got into the car. Mr. Witherspoon drove us away and headed toward his house. I told Stephen his sermon was powerful because it took guts to share personal information with his church. He knew the truth always set him free, and his flock would relate to his struggle. He wanted them to fully understand why he was able to fall in love with me. He said he was constantly under the microscope. I did my best to guarantee him his points were well taken and fully understood. Mr. Witherspoon lived a little distance from the church and had quite a distance also from the bishop. When we arrived, Mrs. Witherspoon came outside to meet us. She was adorable, about 5 feet tall and maybe 110 pounds, soaking wet. I told Mr. Witherspoon he married a living doll. He agreed, twirled her around, and kissed her. She told him this was no way to conduct himself in front of the bishop and his fiancée. He laughed and formally introduced her to me. I hugged her and explained how delighted I was to finally meet her. She felt she already knew me because Maurice told her so much about me. Stephen also hugged Mrs. Witherspoon. Maurice welcomed us to their home and asked us to follow him to the back screened-in porch. They lived in a new townhouse in an attractive neighborhood. The back porch was located just off the kitchen. He gave us glasses of cold lemonade, told us to relax and enjoy the afternoon. Mrs. Witherspoon said she hoped we liked old-fashioned fried chicken. We assured her we did. She brought out chicken, dumplings, lima beans, cabbage, and biscuit. It occurred to me that Stephen and I had not had a real meal since Thursday Eve. We certainly welcomed this wonderful home-cooked meal. Mr. and Mrs. Witherspoon were good cooks. They enjoyed cooking together. Stephen said the blessing. From the first bite, the food was yummy, well seasoned, and well prepared. I told them I did not cook, but appreciated good food. Stephen informed me that Maurice often cooks for him, especially after Mr. Paul became somewhat disabled. Oddly, I felt something on my leg, looked down, and saw a pretty black and white cat. Maurice said he forgot to warn us about their affectionate cat, Boom Boom. The cat got that name because it liked to jump on the bongo drum they have in their home when Mr. Witherspoon played. He said the cat mimicked him as he played the smaller drum. The larger drum made quite a booming sound when the cat swatted it, thus the dawning of the name Boom Boom. Since they have no children, the cat somewhat filled that void. He liked me and meowed to get me to play with him. I told him we'd play after dinner. Mrs. Witherspoon ordered Boom Boom back in the house and closed the door to keep him out. When we had dined sufficiently, Maurice told us there was a special dessert. He brought out a chocolate fondue pot surrounded by plump strawberry. I really liked dipping the strawberries in the pot. The hot chocolate was rich and succulent. Stephen also found the dessert to be very tasty and fun. When we all finished the fondue, they cleared the table, and Mr. Witherspoon put a pitcher of water on the table for our convenience. We kicked back and talked about the miracle of the romance between the bishop and me. I told Marlis her husband has an unusual eye for romance, and he was also one of God's angels. She related to me how he was able to sense things long before she could, and added she thought only women had that ability before meeting him. I wondered whether he confided in her his wish for the bishop and me to connect. She nodded yes. He saw the love in our eyes. I told her they were a charmed couple. She thought they were fortunate to have the bishop as their friend. She made sure I knew he never acted uppity with them. Stephen asked what would be the point to such an action. Marlis went in the house and brought back a book all about black opera singers. She thought I should have it. I thanked her abundantly. I told her she is a little honey pie. I will always treasure that fine book. Unintentionally, she left the door unattended, and Boom Boom came to me again. He just stood looking up at me as if to say, "It's time to play." Mr. Witherspoon gave me a ball of yarn that the cat liked. I unraveled it a bit and dangled it in front of him. He jumped, swatted, and meowed joyously. Stephen didn't know I liked cats that much. I told him in general I was an animal lover. In due time, Stephen said perhaps we should go home. Mr. Witherspoon saw the fatigue on the bishop's face. I expressed sincere appreciation to the Witherspoons for inviting us to their lovely home for such a fine dinner and relaxing afternoon. Stephen put a ditto to my sentiments. I told Marlis we will definitely be friends when I move to D.C. after I am married to the bishop. She said, "It shall be." Mr. W. hugged Marlis and told her he'd be right back. I took the liberty of saying he would be with her all day tomorrow. He asked how so. I explained he had the day off. Looking puzzled, he asked again, "How so?" I looked at Stephen with that don't say anything look and said Mr. W. should have a day to be with his wife. Stephen agreed. We said our goodbyes and left with Mr. W. When we reached the bishop's house, Stephen told him he would call Tuesday to get him up to speed. We both said, "Thanks again for a great afternoon." Mr. Witherspoon exchanged vehicles and left. We went in the house, and Stephen immediately asked me how he was to get to the NABA office tomorrow. I reminded him I could drive him if he knew the way. He chanted in a sing-song manner, "Of course." I could drive him because he did know the route. I likewise chanted with half voice. I am good for much more than he knew, and that I was just getting started. He revealed he was filled with curiosity and awaited experiencing my numerous skills. I swiped my finger under his chin and told him to stay tuned. His facial expression changed significantly. I told him he better take a cold shower. He asked why must it be cold when his heart was so warm. I had no answer, so I took his hand and led him upstairs and into his bedroom. I figured he was tired and should go to bed. He asked what I had in mind. I told him he needed sleep. I turned and quickly exited his room. In a dither, I went to my room and sat on the side of the bed. I decided to prepare for bed. I washed my hands, brushed my teeth, put on a nightgown, and climbed into bed. It was 8:10 p.m. For some reason, I was coming apart at the seams. I sat on the bed with my legs pulled up and my arms around my legs. Unexpectedly, Stephen knocked on my door. I told him to come in. He walked in and stared at me. He took off his robe and slippers and got in bed with me. Needless to say, I was shocked. He ran his fingers through my hair. He touched my neck and shoulders. We didn't speak a word. His fingers caressed my arm. He took my face in his hands and kissed me deeper than ever. He finally spoke, wishing me a happy 2-week anniversary of the moment we fell in love. When his hands lightly brushed my thighs and I was rendered helpless, the heavy breathing and we sighed in interval. We looked at each other and began sobbing. He asked me to turn away from him. He then wrapped his legs and arms around me from behind and held me tightly. He shook as he held me. He whispered how ferociously in love he was with me. He indicated his need to hold me a few minutes, then he would go back to his room. As we remained in that position, I felt his tears drop on my face. My pillow was wet with my tears. although we were dedicated to a spiritual love, which outshines an overtly physical love. There would be times which called for profound closeness. That evening was such a time. True to his word, after approximately 10 minutes, Stephen slowly loosened his hold on me, got out of bed, threw his robe over his shoulders, put on his slippers, and went back to his room. I missed him instantly. I stayed in that position, remembering his body wrapped around mine. It is sad to realize we humans are ruled by a society that connects any sort of intimate alliance with carnal expectations. I know for sure he and I cared not for such. Nevertheless, we longed to be in each other's arms. But because of the assumptions people make, we are forced to wait until we are married to have sublime personal affection in the same bed. The next morning, Stephen got up early enough to make us toast with jam and coffee. I also rose early because I wanted to be ready to transport him to his NABA office. I met him downstairs, kissed him good morning, and asked why he didn't drive. He told me he had witnessed a terrible car accident that spooked him. From that time on, he could not even coax himself into attempting to drive. He prefers not having to think about the movement of an automobile at all. He changed the subject by saying how romantically inspired he is with me every day. Naturally, that statement was one after my own heart, but I told him today he must focus on his job. He said he'd try, but it would be difficult. In jest, I mentioned how well he cooked and concluded he must have studied with the same renowned chefs who taught me at the Cordon Bleu. He said he had exclusive and extensive tutoring. I noted that must be the reason the toast was so good. He affirmed the sentence by answering, "Oui, mademoiselle," gave me the keys to his car, and picked up his bulging attaché case. We got in the car. I backed the big car down the driveway with ease and authority. Stephen was very impressed with my driving ability. I disclosed I had been driving since I was 8 years old. He asked how could that be. I made known how my father instructed me in our driveway and up and down the one-block street on which we lived, after seeing me handle the bumpy cars at Icora Amusement Park in Youngstown. He thought that was remarkable, adding, my father is definitely an atypical man, and liked him for that. I confessed to driving illegally from age 12 to 15, but passed the written and driving test easily at age 16 to get my official driver's license. I boasted I'd never had an accident, but the DC traffic would no doubt challenge my driving skills, especially since I was not accustomed to Stephen's big Lincoln Continental car. Luckily, the route to the NABA office was uncomplicated. Stephen seemed comfortable with me behind the wheel. I told him he would get a charge out of riding in my little Mustang. He wondered if he would even be able to get into my sports car. I assured him he could and that it would be a fun adventure, although not very bishopy. He wanted to know what bishopy meant. I cleared my throat and answered in an extreme, put-on, academic tone of voice, "Bishopy pertaining to something in keeping with the image of a bishop." He cleared his throat and responded, "I see." He confirmed I had quite a sense of humor. With a straight face I asked, "Whatever do you mean?" He shook his head and chuckled. I navigated us successfully to his office without any snags. When we arrived, I parked in his board of directors spot. He got out and opened the door for me. That felt a little strange in light of the fact I was in the driver's seat. Nevertheless, he did, because he is a gentleman. We walked into the building holding hands. Stephen introduced his secretary, Regina Haynes, to me and went in his office. I remained in the outer waiting area and chatted a few minutes with her. She was quite attractive and had a bubbly personality. It took me a few minutes to realize she was confined to a wheelchair. Miss Haynes displayed plenty self-confidence and could be the spokesperson for all disabled people. She was delighted to meet the woman whose singing lit up the NABA banquet 2 weeks earlier, and who is now engaged to the bishop. She remarked how shocking the engagement was to her because the bishop had shown interest in no woman since she was hired 11 years ago. I stated it happened rapidly and totally unexpectedly. She pointed out the bishop kept himself extremely busy, thus making it virtually impossible to think about anything but work. She further noted I obviously swept the bishop off his feet with my beautiful operatic voice. Stephen walked in at that very moment and injected his explanation for how he fell in love with me. He concurred with Miss Haynes about my singing voice, but elaborated by telling her my eyes held him entranced. She called out a big wow to that. He had not spelled that fact out to me, so I was rather taken aback with that revelation. Changing his tone of voice, he asked her for his appointment book and all his mail. She handed him a good-sized stack of mail and a calendar book. I told him I planned to visit the Howland University Library and Archives in order to learn more about our Negro history. He told me his clergy window sticker would get me through the gate and allow me to park on the campus. I will tell them the truth about doing black music research. He asked me to please return before rush hour because the traffic is horrendous from 4 to 6 p.m. As he walked toward his office door, he wanted to know if I had directions to the campus. I answered no, but I was sure Miss Haynes would assist in routing me there. She pulled out a map of the city and told him not to worry. He blew me a kiss, wished me a beneficial time on campus, and went into his office. Since she was born and raised in D.C., she gave easy directions to me, which avoided all the heavily traveled streets. For this I was grateful, because navigating down the streets in that big car would be formidable. I thanked her and went on my way. When I reached the campus, I pulled into the campus police entrance and told the lady in the booth I was there to do some research about black music history and the related black arts for a project at the National NABA office there in D.C. and the Graduate Voice Department at the New England College of Musical Arts in Boston, Massachusetts. The big Lincoln with a clergy sticker made an impression on the lady. I even told her I was the special assistant to the president at the board of directors at NABA, the Honorable Bishop Stephen Gilbert Scottsdale. She perked up from hearing his name and spoke how Bishop Scottsdale exemplifies the tough new direction NABA is taking. She truly wanted me to know she was up on the latest happenings and allowed me to park the car quite near the front entrance of the library. As I entered the library, I noticed a number of students milling around the stacks and sitting in the study carrels. Frankly, it was the first time I had seen a library populated by a majority of black people. I got so excited until it gave me goosebumps. I could not wait to get started searching for information. I asked the reference librarian directions to the cultural arts section and to the archives. She handed me a little map of the library and informed me the archives were only open from 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. Plus, I would need to register at the archives desk for clearance. She recommended I go there first, considering the time constraint. It was already 11:05 a.m., so I headed straight for the archives. After completing the entry requirements, I stepped into the inner sanctum of the archives. 3 other people were using the well-maintained area. My diligent search took me to A Guide to Negro Music, an annotated bibliography of Negro folk music and art music by Negro composers, or based on Negro thematic material, a compendium of 12,163 titles. I was absolutely thrilled to discover the person responsible for this large body of work was the Cleveland, Ohio black music scholar and history-making soprano, Dr. Zelma Watson George, the first black woman to portray a major character on Broadway, singing the role of Madame Flora in Giancarlo Menotti's opera, The Medium. I was bursting with pride, knowing this great woman resided in Cleveland during my undergraduate days at the Cleveland Conservatory of Musical Studies. I wish I had had the opportunity to meet her then. I took copious notes and read until my eyes were tired. For me, finding this information equaled finding pure gold. Much time had passed because a voice on the loudspeaker announced all researchers must leave in 15 minutes. I looked around, wishing I could share my discovery with those around me, but refrained from such action, realizing they too had probably found something important for their scholarly investigations. I gathered my materials and promptly left the premises. The timing was perfect because I could drive back to the NABA office before the beginning of rush hour. I arrived at the office and heard a horrifying story from Miss Haynes, telling me she and the bishop had encountered a severely deranged woman who assaulted her and threatened his life. Shook up, I inquired about her physical condition and his state of being. She calmed me down by affirming they both were okay, and he was in his office pulling himself together. She buzzed him, telling him I had returned. I found him standing by the window. I walked toward him and asked how he was feeling. He said he felt discombobulated and needed to go home. I helped him with his things, and we went into the outer office. He told Miss Haynes she could go home and to take the next day off as well. She wheeled herself to her one-of-a-kind vehicle, a custom-made van. Pushing a button on the door handle opens the driver's side extra-wide slide door. That enables a platform to be lowered onto which she can roll her wheelchair facing toward the front windshield. She pushes another button on the platform that raises, positions, and locks the entire wheelchair, which then becomes the driver's seat. There is a starter switch on the steering column and a drive accelerator button on the steering wheel. The right knee lever is the brake. The left knee lever is reverse and park. It is a fabulous carrier that makes driving possible and easy for her. Stephen locked up the building because the guard would not come until 5 p.m. We got in the car, drove to a Chinese restaurant, picked up some carry-out, and went home. I did not know what to say to him, so I said nothing. I hadn't seen him rattled before. When we got inside the house, he broke the silence. We sat on the couch in the living room, and he told me the sordid details of his confrontation. He conveyed the bizarre nature of the whole thing by stating it was a result of his sermon yesterday, which upset this parishioner. I wanted to know if he knew the woman was mentally unstable. He said he did not, surmised she was normal, but she had a bone to pick with him. I asked what kind of bone. He hesitated, then explained. She became outraged when she heard he was engaged. I failed to understand what our engagement had to do with any part of her life. unless he had made overtures to her in the past. He assured me he barely recognized her, never had a conversation with this woman, nor had any interest in her whatsoever. The woman somehow thought she would eventually get his attention, and the engagement announcement yesterday threw her over the edge. I inquired about her appearance and age. He admitted she was a flashy woman, probably in her late 40s or early 50s. I asked if he had ever been attracted to her. He bellowed, "No, no, 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 no." He then gave a blow-by-blow account of the volatile meeting. The woman came into the office and, seeing no one else was there, sweet-talked Miss Haynes by saying she was a member of Wesley Fellowship Church and needed to speak to the bishop about a serious matter. At that point, she complimented Miss Haynes on her pretty jewelry. When Miss Haynes stuck out her hands to show off her bracelets, the woman pulled her long headscarf, dropped it over Miss Haynes' wrists, telling her the scarf matched her bracelet. As Miss Haynes admired the scarf, the woman stuffed tissues in her mouth, took the scarf and tied Miss Haynes' hands tightly to one wheelchair arm, and swiftly rolled her into the closet. She then stormed into Stephen's office, startling him, slammed the door shut, and yelled he needed her and not the college girl, because she was a real woman. He had the sense to turn on the tape recorder located under the desk. She carried on about wearing sexy clothes and flirting with him for the past 5 years. She was convinced he got some sort of charge out of her, toyed with her, and led her on. Defiantly, she threw off her clothes and demanded him to have sex with her right in his office, proclaiming he always wanted her, so take her right now. When he refused and told her to put on her clothes and leave, she flipped out, reached in her long bag, pulled out a gun, and told him she would kill him on the spot. He tried to calm her down by reasoning with her. He pleaded with her to put the gun away and was as scared as he had ever been because she was totally out of her head and might shoot him. In the meantime, Miss Haynes blew the tissue from her mouth, used a mini Swiss Army knife hidden under her blouse sleeve to free herself, opened the closet door, rolled herself out, and called the police. The police arrived in the nick of time and wrestled the gun away from the deranged woman. They had her put on her clothes, handcuffed her, and took her away. Stephen informed the police he taped the entire incident. Miss Haynes contended she knew her little knife would come in handy one day, but never thought for such an outlandish occurrence. I took him in my arms and held him. We sat quietly. After a short period of time, Stephen said thoughts of being killed jolted him into the reality of just how fragile life is. Although he had done nothing at all to provoke that woman, she saw it from an entirely different angle, which could have ended his life. I had been so busy being happy the past 2 weeks until I could not fathom a violent act which could take Stephen away from me. I called to mind the maniacal manner in which the woman assaulted Miss Haynes in her wheelchair. Stephen decided to call her at home to see how she was facing and faring emotionally and physically. In the course of time, I brought up the fact we should eat the Chinese food on the kitchen table. We were very hungry, so that was good. We moved to the kitchen and devoured the food. Stephen raised the subject of my scholarly explorations. I poured it on about my findings and how I plan to incorporate them into my ongoing regulated master's courses. Stephen touched on the bottom line of why we study what we do. The dominant culture demands all people to do it their way and learn things they deem important. Anything else is incidental and not necessary in their systematic scheme. He hit the nail on the head because throughout my schooling I had learned virtually nothing about the accomplishments of black people. It seemed we were not viewed as real people. Music history books rarely mention a black classical composer. That is why I am determined to debunk the faulty assumptions, evaluations, and flagrant omissions found throughout academia. Stephen praised me for standing strong with my viewpoints. He realized we had similar philosophical frames of mind. With that thought, he managed to come out of his stupor. He marveled at how well we fit together on so many levels. He somewhat let go of the happenings, which bummed him out earlier that day, and replaced his thoughts with good tidings and hope. We returned to the living room. Stephen stepped out and stopped at his stereo and put on an LP. I sat on the couch and wondered what he had chosen to play. Lo and behold, it was the Modern Jazz Quartet, one of the premier ensembles of the 20th century, playing Vendôme, a creative piece which mixes J.S. Bach with polyphonic jazz, and Softly as the Morning Sunrise, an absolute treasure of a chamber piece with touches of counterpoint joining the traditional AABA form. Stephen had sophisticated taste in music, favoring opera, jazz, symphony, spirituals, art songs, classical choral music, a bit of Motown, and of course, black church music. We cuddled and listened to the first-rate recordings, soaking up every nuance of the music. When they ended, I took Stephen's hand and walked over to the piano, sat down and played my improvised version of Softly as the Morning Sunrise. He had not expected me to be able to play it, and certainly not play it the way I did, with intricate harmonic movement and nifty piano riffs which melted into the melody. Having been knocked off his feet, he asked me how long I'd played jazz piano. I replied, as long as I've heard music, meaning no matter the type or style of music, I can play it if I hear it. Just then, I got a great idea. Teach Stephen to play something. He sat on the piano bench beside me. I asked him to place his fingers on the keyboard. He sniggled, but complied. I proceeded to teach him to play an elaborate version of the children's song, Yes, Jesus Loves Me. I must say he was a very good student. Then I played it and asked him to sing. He had a clear, full-bodied baritone voice. We kept at it for a while, singing a variety of songs together, and had a fun evening. Stephen was feeling much better. It was the ideal way to end a very trying day. He asked if I would stay with him until Saturday instead of leaving Wednesday. He had grown accustomed to having me there and couldn't bear the thought of being without me. Seeing the sad puppy dog look on his face, I agreed to book a flight to Youngstown Saturday. He would also leave Saturday to attend a NABA meeting in St. Louis, thus eliminating the possibility of loneliness in his house. I called him to tell Mommy my plans. I actually called home to tell Mommy my plans. Daddy answered the phone and was very happy to hear my voice. He told me he would pick me up at the airport. I asked about Mommy's whereabouts and found out she was upstairs sewing on the old pedal sewing machine. In like manner, he asked how the bishop was. So I handed the phone to Stephen. Daddy was delighted to hear the bishop's voice. My two favorite guys instantly started chatting. To hear Stephen laugh at something Daddy said meant the world to me. After they completed their conversation, Stephen handed the phone back in order for me to say goodbye. Stephen claimed I got my sense of humor from Daddy. I admitted he was right and promised to lift his spirits as much as I could with laughter. It was bedtime, so we went upstairs, wished each other a good night's sleep, kissed affectionately, and went to our bedroom. Tuesday began as a typical working day for Stephen, but a rather floating day for me. By that, I mean I had no concrete plans. Mr. W. showed up right on time to take Stephen to the NABA office. We told him about yesterday's debacle, which really shocked him. Because Stephen had a full schedule, our morning hellos and goodbyes were brief, garnished with a kiss. I figured because of yesterday, he dreaded going to the office, but he would not have Miss Haynes there. I could tell he already put himself in the frame of mind to tackle everything with verve. I asked if I could call Miss Haynes. He thought that would be wonderful and gave me her telephone number. He also planned to call her from the office. Stephen and Mr. W. drove away. I ate some cornflakes and called Miss Haynes. She was feeling fine, but appreciated having the day off. Directly after that, I decided to go downstairs and flip up one end of the ping pong table, which would permit me to play solitaire table tennis. Positioning that table was tricky, but I finally got it to work. While serving balls and hitting them repeatedly as they furiously came back to me, I suddenly remembered my sophomore dorm roommate, Alice, from the University of the Western Reserve. D.C. was her hometown. I stopped playing, went upstairs to my room, looked up her telephone number in my address book, and called her. A child's voice answered the phone. I asked to speak to Alice. The child asked me who I was. I said I was a former roommate of hers from college. The child hollered, "Alice, some girl from college wants to talk to you." Alice took the phone and said hello. I sang my name to her, and she screamed with excitement. We were so thrilled to talk to each other until we interrupted or talked over ourselves again and again. The child who answered the phone was her nephew visiting from Minneapolis. Alice was completing graduate studies at the Washington Catholic College and a year ago had married her sweetheart from the University of the Western Reserve. I was overjoyed hearing how happy she was. In due time, I told her my story. She was absolutely blown away by the details. It occurred to me to ask if she would be in my wedding party next year in New York City. She said yes almost before I could get the words out of my mouth and asked my present location in D.C. Not knowing the names of the specific areas, I could only tell her the street address. Since her husband was at work, she had some time and wondered if we could get together. I yelped, "Yes! Yay!" She said not to worry, she'd find me. It took about 1 hour and 10 minutes for her to get to me, but she made it. What a sight it was to see us jumping up and down and hugging like little children on Christmas morning. She brought her cute 4-year-old blonde-haired nephew, Woody, because she was babysitting him while her sister interviewed for 2 jobs. Alice was impressed with the bishop's house and determined I was headed for a glorious life with him and my voice career. I asked if she wanted a beverage, and she accepted a glass of lemonade. We sat in the kitchen, caught up with the years since we were roommates. Woody was a surprisingly quiet child who sat on her lap and listened until he fell asleep. They stayed until 3:35 p.m. Her visit brightened my day and put me in a very good mood. Mr. W. brought Stephen home at 4:40 p.m., an hour earlier than I expected. Brought a bag in the house and, like usual, switched cars and went home. I met Stephen outside, hugged him, and took his attaché case. He asked me to forgive his fatigue, but he was beat. There were 2 spaghetti and meatball dinners in the bag. I took them out and recommended we eat the dinners. He speculated he had not eaten, which added to the factor of his fatigue. As we ate, I told him about Alice's visit. He was pleased I had company over. He noted that his house had seen more activity in the past 2.5 weeks than since he moved there 7 years ago. We finished and went into the study. He admitted that all the excitement had taken a heavy toll on his body. He was exhausted. I took his hand and led him upstairs into his bedroom. I asked him to sit on the side of the bed while I ran warm water in his bathtub. I suggested he take a long soaking bath and promised to give him a medicinal massage afterwards. He did as I recommended, then put on his pajamas, came back into his bedroom, and stretched out on the bed face down. I proceeded to massage his neck, shoulders, arms, hands, and back. Within moments he fell asleep. I pulled the covers over him, walked out of his room, leaving the door open enough to be able to check on him without disturbing his rest, and went to my room. It was merely 7 p.m., so I read 2 magazines I brought but hadn't read. About 9:30 p.m. I felt sleepy, got out of bed, went across the hall and peeked in on. He had not moved from his original position and was sleeping soundly. He did not snore, but instead sort of sizzled while sleeping. I subsequently prepared for bed and ultimately dropped off to sleep. I awakened at 6:35 Wednesday morning, immediately got up and checked on Stephen. He was still sound asleep. So I went back to my room and took a shower. As I was dressing, I heard him stirring in his bedroom. It was a bit after 7 a.m., which meant he slept 12 hours since 7 p.m. I went down to the kitchen and made some cream of wheat and instant coffee. I didn't even know how to percolate coffee. After a while, he came into the kitchen wearing his robe and slippers. He greeted me with, "Hi, Cupcake," and hugged me. He was cognizant of the fact he slept a long time and felt a lot better as a result of that sleep. He also concluded he was on the verge of collapsing yesterday. I told him he fell asleep as I massaged him. He remembered how relaxed he was as I rubbed his tired muscles. He thanked me for being so attentive to him. I served him a bowl of cream of wheat and poured a cup of coffee. Kiddingly, he mentioned how my cooking skills had once more surfaced and saved us from starvation. I retorted, "Wonders never cease, my love." Hence, he informed me since he got so much work done yesterday, he would not need to go into the office today. The president of the local D.C. NABA chapter would be there instead. That good news meant I had him all to myself the entire day. He further stated he wanted to hear about the music festival of the Berkshire because he intended to take some vacation time and to visit me there during the summer. I was absolutely overjoyed to hear his plans because an entire summer would be a long time without him. I told him I function in a different world and welcomed the chance to have him experience it. I explained I auditioned at New York City's famous Manhattan Carnegie Music Hall Auditorium near the end of my senior year at the Cleveland Conservatory of Musical Studies and received a voice fellowship to perform at the prestigious Music Festival of the Berkshires, summer home of the Boston Philharmonic Symphony. Again, I hit the jackpot for a young up-and-coming classical singer. Performing at high-rated summer festivals means as much or more than being a scholarship student at well-known music schools. I had been selected from a pool of the best young singers in the entire country. The fact that I was black meant I had to be better than the best because the classical music world still looks away from black talent unless we knock them out with our outstanding ability. Out in Aspen, I was one of only 6 black students, 5 singers and 1 violist. All 6 of us were magnificent. There was only 1 black faculty. Last year at the Berkshires, there were only 3 black singers. No blacks played in the orchestra, and no blacks were coaches or teachers on any level. Occasionally, however, there were famous black soloists who sang designated opera roles or oratorio parts. The areas surrounding the festival are populated with well-to-do snobby people, and the concert goers mirrored the residents. I'm used to those types, so they didn't bother me. Nevertheless, I am always alert and ready to go toe-to-toe with any of them at any time. The participants with fellowships are wonderful. They are so caught up in the music and the festival itself until they don't waste time being prejudiced. View me as a top soprano, and that is that. I am lucky to have this sort of music opportunity. I represent black people when I perform, and I take that seriously. There is unfortunately in the top tier of classical music the tendency for privileged blacks to ignore other black people. The 1 or 2 tend to enjoy the attention and resent the intrusion of any other. I resist that attitude and keep praying for more of us to appear and knock their socks off with roof-raising performances. Stephen listened attentively and remarked, I was on a battlefield almost totally unknown to most of us. He knew it was tough to get recognized, but he was not aware of the subtleties involved in the world of classical music. Now he knew why I was so poised and classy whenever I faced the public in any capacity. I continued by telling him the people who live in Western Massachusetts will be fascinated with him because they have never heard of the major black Christian denominations and will be quite impressed and intimidated by his bishop's status. They might fear him when they find out he is the chairman of the board at NABA. But so be it. He asked where I lived while there. I told him we were housed in the dorms at a boys' prep school. I could tell he needed to know how he would maneuver his visit. I assured him I'd take care of him and give him a special visitor's pass, which would allow him to see everything. I did, however, need Miss Haynes to contact the festival office and pour it on about the bishop's planned visit. He will be a celebrity guest. He also needed to reserve a small cottage. He said he felt he was preparing to go into outer space. I replied, he was. Stephen began to understand how challenging it would be for him to be my fiancé. Heretofore, I have been in the position of being his fiancé. He has always been in charge and in the spotlight. Now he must prepare to simply be my boyfriend. He can do nothing in my high-powered classical music world but watch. No one will know him. All the references will be through me. For instance, they might say, that man standing over there is Johanna Danye's fiancé. Or, the soprano soloist, Johanna Danye, is engaged to marry the distinguished man standing over there. He will get the once-over this time. Stephen maintained he should take a backseat to me in my music world. He is proud of my accomplishments and know I am on the verge of a dynamic voice career. He pointed out it was my singing voice that ignited him and threw him into my arms. He will gladly accept the label, her man. In fact, he rather likes it, although I never put it quite that way. I nevertheless like the sound of those two words. In jest, I strutted around saying, my man is right over there waiting for me. He in turn uttered, my woman is the finest in the land, and I am her man. We laughed wildly. I took his arm and walked outside. He immediately brought up the fact he was not clothed. I disagreed, saying he was clothed, just not in clothes he normally wore outside. I tried to convince him that no one would see him in his backyard, as his neighbors were quite a distance away. He still had reservations until we walked into the garden and sat on the love's bench. I put my arms around him and expressed how much the garden meant to me. He said it was a symbol of our love. He elaborated further how God took control of us and nourished our love, just as each flower is nourished in the garden. We walked casually back to the house. I noticed how much the flowers had grown since our magical moments there. Abruptly, Stephen blurted, he had a taste for a sloppy Joe. That certainly surprised me, but in a good way. I inquired where one would get such a delicacy. He chuckled, saying there was a rather funky place called Bailey's about a mile away that sold them. I wanted to know if he would like for me to go there and purchase some for us, and he did want that. He wrote out directions, and I drove there and bought 5 sandwiches and chips. When I returned, he was happy as a clam to chow down on the fun food. To tell the truth, I was just as happy, because I really like sloppy joes. He appeared to be a lot more refreshed and energetic after eating. Following that meal, we went down to the rec room and sat on the couch. Stephen seemed pensive. He disclosed how he dreaded parting ways with me this coming Saturday, and poured out his heart as he revealed how profoundly he loved me. He didn't know how he would fare without me during the summer. Naturally, I also had the feeling of trepidation concerning the summer without him. I told him, absence makes the heart grow fonder. Furthermore, we had full schedules that would keep us tremendously busy. He grunted, yeah, but I failed to sway his train of thought, really because I was on the same track. Impulsively, somehow, I managed to latch on to positive reasoning, which entailed enjoying the time we had right at that moment. He was in complete accord with my line of thinking and initiated some affection. I jumped right on board and eagerly returned his advances. We played footsies and nuzzled each other on the couch. I took his hand. He kissed my neck. We marveled at the way we complimented each other. All at once he asked if I could receive phone calls at the music festival. I told him it would be better if I called him on the payphone. Once I had my schedule for the season, I could set up a phone time for us. If, however, he really needed to get through to me, he could call the office and leave a message, and I would get back to him as soon as possible. I noticed he was sliding back into sadness, so I tried to change the subject. He grabbed me and held me so tight until one arm got numb. He kept saying he could not live without me. I reminded him I was his forever. I think he had gone back to the time he lost his wife and could not bear being separated from me. I coddled him and reassured him I would be by his side. In an instant he realized just how deeply he had suffered and how terrified he was to be alone again. I held him and rocked him. He never had anyone to physically hold him during his dark days. His feelings and emotions had never been addressed adequately, so now he needed me in a profound way. That scenario made me love him even more, and right then I made a major decision to somehow blend my music career with his demanding career. Our bond had been strengthened from the realities of the upcoming summer. We benefited from the night's sleep, but I so wished I could have held him all night. Although sometimes difficult, Stephen is adhering to his views, beliefs, teachings, and ruling concerning proper conduct befitting a bishop and a God-regulated man, which forbids any intimate physical contact on a nightly basis until we are married. Thursday morning, after greeting each other in the hall, we came to the determination to make the most of every minute we have until we part Saturday. Stephen had prayed for guidance in his relationship with me and appeared much stronger and focused. He asked if I would take him to the office to drop off some papers for Miss Haynes. He also wanted us to have lunch with Mr. Norman Paul at the Edgewood Senior Center nearby. Upon hearing himself speak, he apologized for asking in such a commanding tone of voice. I eased his concern by expressing my understanding of the manner in which he deals with his sense of duty and that I was not offended by his approach. After all, he has been the man in charge for a very long time and sometimes blurs the lines between his personal and business lives. In light-hearted fashion, I put both hands on his shoulders and told him to watch out when I began ordering him around. He became instantly intrigued and meekly asked me to order him around. I straightened up, marched all the way around him, and demanded he kiss me. He answered, "Yes, ma'am," dipped me Hollywood style, and kissed me. I indicated he did not kiss me long enough and must repeat the action. Again he answered, "Yes, ma'am," dipped me and kissed me a lot long. When he brought me up for air, I told him he passed the test, but might incur pop quizzes at any time, so be prepared. He acknowledged enjoying being ordered around by me. I put my finger to my mouth, gave him a shh, and beckoned him to get in the car. We played the game all the way to the office, which was a hoot. Upon arriving at the office, I went inside with Stephen to see Miss Haynes. We spoke to her, and Stephen went in his office to retrieve whatever he needed. She was her usual bubbly self. I expressed extreme gratitude for saving the bishop's life and made sure she knew she was a heroine. Her bravery was extraordinary. Of course, she came back with anyone would have done the same. I disagreed and reminded her she showed immense courage, and I was proud to know her. I then gave her the information needed when making arrangements for the bishop to visit the music festival of the Berkshires. I asked her to emphasize how prominent the bishop was in the conversation and that his presence was a major one. She promised to bring them to their knees. Quite a few people were in the building that day. That previous strange Monday, I had not realized there were so many other offices because they were closed. The bishop came out, thanked her again for her bravery, and told her he would see her in a couple weeks. I said goodbye and informed her I'd see her when I returned to D.C. in the fall. She wished me well at the music festival. On the way to visit Mr. Paul, Stephen told me Miss Haynes was blessed to have a loving and supportive family that allowed her to develop into an independent woman. He added that a new insurance man who works in the building expressed interest in her and took her on a date a few weeks ago. He actually rented a handicapped-equipped van to transport her to the Smithsonian and to a restaurant. They really like each other and visit each other regularly. Stephen hopes they take the next step into matrimony. We arrived at the senior center just in time for lunch. The receptionist buzzed Mr. Paul and directed us to the dining room. Shortly, Mr. Paul joined us at the dining table. He and Stephen hugged and were very happy to see each other. Stephen reintroduced me to Mr. Paul, explaining we were engaged to be married. Surprised, Mr. Paul asked when and how this had all come about. Stephen explained we confessed our love in the garden about 30 minutes after his retirement luncheon. Mr. Paul needed more clarification and asked how we knew each other. Stephen did a good job relaying information to him and ended by saying we were extremely happy together. Being very observant, Mr. Paul noted all that had occurred with only 2.5 weeks. He looked at us and said he saw true and profound love on our faces. He even shocked us by saying he knew something was up when Stephen stepped out of the room at his luncheon. I asked what he meant. Continuing, he felt Stephen was going through something so personal until he had to leave the room in order to cope with his feelings. It appeared Stephen was moved by the moment during the singing, but there was much more going on, and now he fully understood. The combination of him, me, and the Spirit of God sent Stephen reeling. Stephen gave thumbs up to Mr. Paul's assessment and added he could never pull the wool over his eyes about anything. Mr. Paul gave us his blessing and added Stephen needed to love a woman and to have a woman's love. Right then, Mr. Paul sprang something on us. He observed love was in the air because he too had found someone. Stephen was totally dumbfounded and wanted to hear more. It seems the day Mr. Paul moved to the facility, a lady was there visiting her aunt who caught Mr. Paul's eye. Since he was new, he asked this lady a few questions about the center. She graciously answered his questions and said she would also visit him when the time came to see her aunt. This 66-year-old lady named Beatrice began bringing Mr. Paul special little items and made baked goods. A week ago, she brought him a lightweight summer jacket, and as she helped him put it on, Mr. Paul kissed her on the cheek. She kissed him back. Suddenly, they realized they had feelings for each other. The lady had never married and was the director of a travel agency. He never thought anyone would get his attention, but at 80 years of old, he is smitten by Beatrice. Stephen was so happy to hear this news until, in his excitement, he lifted Mr. Paul off the floor as he hugged him. Who could have predicted these two men would find love at nearly the same time? Jubilantly, they gave each other high fives. I, too, was happy for Mr. Paul and looked forward to meeting Beatrice. We thoroughly enjoyed having lunch with Mr. Paul and seeing the twinkle in his eyes. Mr. Paul had been a bachelor all his life and regularly assisted ladies in their times of need as a sort of knight in shining armor for the damsel in distress. However, he never followed through romantically because the majority of ladies had taken advantage of his kindness and generosity, thus making him leery of most women. Now, however, in spite of his age, he finally found a lady who genuinely cares for him. As Mr. Paul walked down the corridor with us to the front door, I noticed he had more pep to his step. We wished him continued happiness, and he wished us the same. He was astonished to see me driving the bishop's car and remarked, "I know you have him, if you are driving that big Lincoln." I laughed and told him I'd see him and his lady in the fall. On the way home, Stephen was noticeably more cheerful and downright upbeat. He asked me to drive to a particular park area not far from his house, which has a huge meadow. He wanted to walk with me through that meadow. I drove us to the meadow, which had a large pond and many wild flowers. We got out, held hands, and strolled through the meadow, stopping periodically to hold each other. Stephen was a very romantic and sentimental man. I bathed in the glorious moments we shared and thanked God for uniting us. Since evening was approaching, we were obliged to go home. We got in the car, sat a while, and watched the sunset. No two people could have been more in love. Stephen gave me a flower to play. He loves me not. I pulled off the petals, which ended with, he loves me. He mentioned even the flowers complied with our love. We had taken in a simply delightful day. When we got home, I went straight to the piano and sang for Stephen the beautiful aria Un bel dì, translated means one fine day, from Puccini's famous opera Madame Butterfly. Although it tells of a woman waiting for the man she loves, I sang it to tell Stephen we would wait for each other, and one fine day we would be together in matrimony. He looked at me assiduously and proclaimed he had never heard that aria sung so beautifully. He realized I had a profound grasp of our romantic situation. If it is God's will, we shall have the marriage we deserve. He also thought I was able to influence him about almost anything if I sang to him. He loved the sound of my voice, and I loved pleasing him with it. He looked at me so fervently until it felt as though he saw inside me. We could not get enough of each other. Another day had ended, bringing us closer to Saturday. This day had been a very nice day. We kissed goodnight and went to our room. Friday was a cloudy day that gave the impression rain occupied the space inside the clouds, and precipitation might arrive soon. I picked up my clipboard, took it into the bathroom, and somehow managed to drop it on the floor. It made such a loud noise until Stephen rushed over, knocked on my door, and asked if I was okay. I opened the door and embarrassingly confessed to being clumsy. I reminded him that sounds are amplified in bathrooms. He let it be known he is tremendously concerned about my well-being and might tend to overreact to things sometimes. That bit of information warmed the cockles of my heart. He conveyed to me he was packing his clothes that morning, and he knocked the entire suitcase on the floor, spilling all that he had carefully arranged. However, because the floor was carpeted, The noise was minimal. In any case, the incidents required him to start packing all over again. Subsequently, I brought my luggage from the closet and began packing my clothes. The time had come for me to get a grip on reality. Today was to be our last full day together. We both will leave tomorrow morning, June 10th, and not see each other again until Friday, June 30th. We will have less than one day because I must report to the music festival on Saturday, July 1st. Stephen reported he worked out his schedule to visit me twice at the festival, Monday, July 10th through Tuesday, July 18th, his birthday, and Friday, August 18th through Sunday, August 20th. What stupendous news he divulged. It took some doing to arrange his business to accommodate coming to Western Massachusetts, but Stephen was determined to see me on my turf. He not only proved his enormous love for me, but also affirmed respect for my musical life. I thanked him profusely for his efforts. Now I will be able to formulate my summer timetable, and to include seeing my fiancé. I like the sound of that. Stephen made many business calls that morning and trimmed all the loose ends necessary for him to function the next 10 to 12 days in St. Louis and Louisville, Kentucky. His next 2 trips were all about the National Association for the Betterment of Black Americans. His dual positions sometimes intersect and blend his responsibilities enough for him to be ready for almost anything. He truly lives out of his suitcases. This cloudy, humid, drizzly day did nothing to lift my spirits. I completed my packing and waited for him in the downstairs foyer. While lingering, I recalled the amusing and amazing 3 weeks, which totally changed my life. His house and car have been the focal points of the new chapter of my life. Everything I am is now centered around Stephen. Although no one knows what the future has in store, I'm positive I am in for a major league shift in the dynamics of my life. I felt somewhat lost sitting there until Stephen joined me. He voiced the fact that his innermost state of mind had been unlocked, releasing years of pent-up emotions. He desperately wanted to thank me for helping him breathe freely again. That statement reinforced my decision to discuss with him thoughts of somehow blending my budding music career with his very established and distinguished career and functioning together as a unit. After hearing my resolution, he realized our union had far greater ramifications than met the eye. He concluded I was a visionary and encouraged me to investigate the possibilities pertaining to an alliance which could affect the very fiber of American life. I assured him I would engineer an archetypal design that will illustrate such a collaboration. He knew I had something cooking inside me and supported all avenues leading to the outer limits of my mind. I eased the serious nature of our conversation by admitting I was hungry. He was too, and had secretly made reservations for us at a small, quaint seafood on the banks of the Potomac River. Although Stephen did not drive, he knew his way around town quite well. He informed me how to advance toward Ricky's River Rendezvous with great ease. The slightly out-of-the-way location made it a perfect romantic spot. Upon our arrival, I opened the umbrella under which we could huddle and walked inside. We were seated next to a window which allowed us to have a panoramic view. Stephen ordered filet of sole for us. I was pleased he ordered because I knew very little about seafood. He reached across the table, took my hand, and said he loved me. I was moved, but could only shake my head affirmative. As we tenderly looked at each other, the waitress brought the bread, butter, and salads and water. We didn't talk much. Finally, the waitress brought the food. It was quite good. Stephen tried to be cheerful, but his heart was not in it. We commented on the picturesque scenery and that history books say President George Washington spent time in this area. Out of nowhere, I exclaimed, we had spent 3 magnificent weeks together and were about to be separated for 3 weeks. Stephen hoped I hadn't noticed the length of time because it would only exacerbate the reality of our time apart. I asked, how were we to exist without each other? Stephen answered, with great difficulty, but also with great anticipation of the June 30th date when we will see each other again. He elaborated by using the example of the half glass of water, noting if we say the glass is half empty, we become disheartened. But if we say the glass is half full, we are encouraged and hopeful. Somehow, that example bolstered my mood. Remarkably, I was able to look at our upcoming time apart as an opportunity to refuel, reorganize, reactivate, and recultivate whatever is needed to provide a strong union with each other. Stephen promised to call every other day. That way, we could disseminate information and or progress made concerning anything we undertook. These terms were tolerable and somewhat exciting. They would require us to be in touch with our every move to report accurately to each other. My oh my, we had created a doozy of a survival game. That generated so much excitement until we ordered key lime pie for dessert with white grape juice to drink. Stephen expounded on the value of perspective and guaranteed to preach on that topic his next trip to the pulpit. Coming to this restaurant brought about a resolution to a problem and allowed us to savor our last day together. By the time we were ready to leave, it had stopped raining, but the gray skies persisted. Stephen put his arm around me as we walked to the car. Like always, he opened the door and made sure I was seated adequately. After he got in, I touched his arm, closed my eyes, and took a deep breath. Our bond was unflappable. We were supplied with everything needed to withstand the upcoming challenge. Because of the Friday traffic, I drove slower than normal and remained contemplative. From time to time, we made senseless small talk to mask our uneasiness. Finally, at home, we entered the house, walked down the hallway, went upstairs, held each other a couple minutes, and eventually faced up to the inevitable. We needed to go to bed because we had to get to the airport fairly early in the morning. But before retiring, I sheepishly presented him with a rather unusual request. I inquired whether I might have a pair of his pajamas. Looking perplexed, he asked me why I wanted them. Acting like a little girl, I passed on my need to be with him so much until wearing his pajamas would allow me to be wrapped in his essence when we were apart. Being completely astonished and touched by my appeal, he compassionately consented to my request. Pulling my leg, he came back, with needing one of my nighties to wear for the same reason. I convinced him to not take any of my nightwear because it was forbidden under the strict rules of bishop behavior. That sounded so absurd until we just laughed mightily. It was a riot poking a little fun at my pajama fixation. When all was said and done, we kissed goodnight and went into our rooms. I was up Saturday morning, put my luggage downstairs, and waited for Mr. Witherspoon to arrive. Stephen followed me downstairs with his luggage and briefcase. We smiled at each other, gave an energetic hug and a lively good morning. With tongue in cheek, I made it known I expected him to behave himself in St. Louis and Louisville. He enjoyed getting the once-over and gave his word of honor. He had never heard this word behave applied to him because he is a bishop. I knew my sense of humor would get us through the morning. Mr. W. drove up, on time as usual. He whooped a strong "Good morning" to us and was in a very good mood. We had seen little of him that week, so I am sure he enjoyed spending time with his wife. Besides being a driver, he takes care of the bishop's house whenever he is away on business. He declared he has the best job on the planet. We got in the car and headed for the airport. Mr. W. said Marlis sent greetings and wished me unperilled. Mr. W. said Marlis sent greetings and wished me success at the music festival. I leaned on Stephen as we held hands in the car. When we arrived at the airport, he kissed me tenderly and reminded me to cross off the days on the calendar so the time will pass quicker. I said goodbye to Mr. W. We were leaving at different times from different air carriers located in different directions. So Stephen and I bid farewell, hugged, and went on our separate ways. It seemed so strange walking by myself. I went to the counter, checked my luggage, and found a seat in the waiting area. Considering my waiting time was nearly 2 hours, I bought an ebony magazine to read. Only prop planes flew into Youngstown, so I was in for a noisy flight. My plane was on time. I boarded, sat down, clicked my seatbelt, and immediately fell asleep. Within a short period of time, the plane landed in Youngstown. I instantly saw Daddy's smiling face in the crowd as I deboarded the plane. I hugged him and expressed my pleasure seeing him. He appeared to be happy to see me too. We got my luggage off the baggage carousel and walked to the car. To my surprise, Mommy was in the car. She got out and practically tackled me with a tight grip and admitted she wanted me to come home. I forgot that parents need to see their children from time to time. No matter how old I may be, I am still my mommy's baby. I was privileged to have loving, supportive, and understanding parents. Daddy took us to a little hot dog place in Warren. I began giving a detailed account of my experiences since I left them 2 weeks ago. They were pleased to hear how I handled the commission of bishops, and particularly happy to know Stephen's grown children had given their approval. I recounted the horrors of the crazy naked lady incidents, which made them understand why the bishop needed me to stay with him a few days longer. Daddy commented, he bet there are lots of women who wanted the bishop, but his daughter won the bishop's heart. Mommy scolded Daddy and requested him to stop bragging. I also relayed to them Stephen's plan to visit me twice at the music festival and emphasized how he would be known as my gentleman friend. Such a designation he has never encountered before in his life. They will not know how prominent a man he is. He will get a taste of my classical music world, where I will be the centerpiece. Mama said if he fares well there, you two will be totally set for marriage. She pointed out that the bishop and I had lives which put us in the spotlight, and we might find taking a backseat to each other somewhat challenging at times, especially for him. I assured her I was aware of the dynamic and would do my best to smooth any bumps on the path to marriage and beyond. She concluded by looking at Daddy and saying, "Men have fragile egos." Daddy said, "Do not." Mommy said, "Do too." And I said, "Shh, shh, shush, shush." It was fun sitting and chatting with them and eating fun food. We finished and headed homeward. Daddy made 2 stops, one at a convenience store and the other at a hardware store. On the way home, I felt I was in the twilight zone. I had 3 distinct lives: the daughter of 2 fabulous parents, a graduate voice student at a major music school, and a woman engaged to be married to a prominent bishop. I really needed a break, and coming home was the perfect solution. I did not know just how tired I was until we got home. All the fatigue released itself, so I excused myself and went to bed. Before going to bed, I unpacked all my clothes, put them in piles to be washed or sent to the cleaners, stacked my books and music neatly, and stored my luggage in the closet. I hid Stephen's PJs in the back of my drawer in my dresser. I am a neat freak who is unable to function if chaos surrounds me. Now, with those chores completed, I could decorously go to bed. It was 8:49 p.m. As I climbed into bed, I recalled Stephen slept in my bed 2 weeks earlier. I curled up and thought of him until I dozed off. I awakened at 6:42 a.m. Sunday morning to the smell of coffee and realized Daddy had gone to work. His schedule was the 7 to 3 shift, and he leaves home about 5:30 a.m. I wondered if Mama planned to go to church. I also wondered if Mama missed church on the Sundays Daddy worked that shift ever since I left home. Like the bishop, Mama never learned how to drive. I had no desire to go to church or any place else, so I hoped she would stay at home. I dragged myself out of bed, dawdled to the bathroom, went downstairs, and met Mama in the kitchen reading the Sunday newspaper. She was in a chipper mood. She had made hoe cake and had eggs and fried apples ready to put in the second skillet. I loved hoe cake bread and had not tasted any since I left home. I declared that all the gourmet food put together could not touch my mother's down-home cooking. Mama laughed hard at my enthusiastic reaction to hoe cake. I wanted to eat the entire skillet full of bread. I grabbed her, kissed her over and over, and thanked her for making it. She said I was quite welcome and just loved seeing me excited about eating her cooking. I get downright silly by saying, "Ha ha, let the church say amen to Mama's food." Then I said a long amen. Mama said I should do a comedy routine for television because I was hilarious. I told her the bishop also thought I was funny. She felt I got that from Daddy because he's always making people laugh. I threw her a curve by disclosing she was also humorous in the way she reacts to certain things. She had not caught on to the reasons people sometimes looked at her and began laughing. I went on by saying her expressions break people up. I wrapped up the subject by suggesting maybe the 3 of us should go on television and become the first black family comedy team. They say laughter is the best medicine, so we could heal the world of its ills. I asked Mama her plans for the day. She made my day by saying she was playing hooky from church that morning, but she had a celestial pass from the Almighty. I brought to her attention again that she was funny, because God didn't have celestial passes for people who skipped church. The truth of the matter, she did not go to church when Daddy worked this shift, and always alerted the choir about those Sundays. Sometimes she got a ride from church members who lived nearby, but she was uncomfortable depending on anyone. I mentioned I could take her to church, but I did not want to attend. I was not up to facing the people who witnessed the special love service and announcement of my engagement to the bishop a few weeks ago. Mama understood, but was not up for that either and preferred staying home. Instead, we talked to each other and she started cooking Sunday dinner. She opened the refrigerator, took out a ham, and began preparing it. About 10 minutes after 9, the phone rang. Mama answered the phone and began chatting gleefully. She called me to the phone and told me it was the bishop. I was so happy to hear his voice. He feared he might have missed me because it was only 10 minutes after 8 in St. Louis, and he forgot about the time difference. I whispered in a loud voice, "Mama and I are playing hooky from church this morning." He whispered back, "So am I." I was shocked. I guess I thought a bishop would always go to church. He confessed to needing some time away from people since he would lead the committee at the St. Louis NABA officers' dinner at 2:30 p.m. He reminded me he is an older man who could not be everywhere and do everything. I apologized for my assumptions and playfully came back with, "But Stephen, you are my Superman." He retorted, "Yeah, Superman has aged, slowed down, and has a worn-out cape." I begged to differ. I specified he is a man who has accumulated monumental years, reworked his obligations to better fit a less all-consuming schedule, and, not to be outdone, had at his disposal the latest intergalactic cape with a large pumpkin painted on it. Chuckling, he owned up to preferring my take on his circumstances and inquired about the whereabouts of his stylish cape. I eased his uncertainty by acknowledging holding it in my hands at that very moment and reaping the benefits of its enormous energy. He muttered, "All right, you got me." I came back with, "I hope I have you, because I sure do love you and plan to marry you." He verbalized I had him so much until he was tripping over the English language, trying to find the right words to say how much he loves me and misses me. Just think. 3 weeks ago, he was a man going about life in a pattern he created to enable himself to withstand the rigors of his demanding schedule. There was no thought of a woman entering his life. In fact, his schedule didn't grant much personal time at all. Now, be that as it may, he is walking around like a love-sick puppy because a certain woman has blown his mind. Room service knocked on the door, so he had to hang up, but looked forward to talking to me Tuesday. Hastily we said goodbye with audible kisses. Mommy noticed my concerned facial expression and asked how I felt. I told her my alliance with the bishop was extraordinary on many levels. We were drawn to each other by the most powerful magnet known to man, God Almighty. With this union comes certain responsibilities and realities. We've only scratched the surface of the possibilities associated with our bonding. Mommy agreed and advised me to listen to God and follow with my heart. I took the newspaper into the living room and began reading it. I turned to the rotogravure section, located in the middle of the thick Sunday paper. It always had the most interesting and informative stories connected to the sepia-colored section. The time passed quickly because I heard Daddy rumbling on the back porch. He came in, kissed Mama, and asked my whereabouts. I walked in, threw my arms up in the air, and said, "I'm right here." He shared that night in the mill had been rough. There had been a serious accident as a result of equipment malfunction. One of his best buddies was seriously injured. He knew his friend's life was in the hand of God. I felt Daddy's pain. He was teary-eyed. I insisted we pray and asked God to spare the man's life. We three stood together and prayed earnestly. When we finished praying, Daddy called the hospital for an update on his friend's condition. He was told the man pulled through surgery and was in stable condition. Daddy was relieved and credited our prayer to aiding in saving his buddy's life. Mama comforted Daddy and called us to the kitchen table for dinner. Daddy was Youngstown's first black crane operator at Federation Steel Mill. He seemed intrinsically tied to the company and loved his mill partners. He often told us priceless stories about mill life. The stories gave me an education about how steel was made. As always, dinner was delicious, and as in the past, I ate too much. I worked off some calories by washing dishes, something I enjoyed doing. After I cleaned up the kitchen, I joined my folks in the living room looking at television. It was a tradition to watch the Ed Sullivan Show at 8 p.m., but it was only 7 p.m., so they were watching Lassie, the sensitive and intelligent female collie dog. Next on tap at 7:30 p.m. was the adventures of Gentle Ben, the lovable bear. At last it was 8 p.m., and there he was, Ed Sullivan, announcing his signature really big shoe entertainers for the evening. I was overjoyed to hear Eartha Kitt would perform. The Smothers Brothers followed Ed Sullivan and ended with an exciting episode that night of Mission Impossible, all on CBS. I had not watched TV for a while, as I was generally too busy in school for such a luxury. I nevertheless basked in the glory of Sunday evening TV with my parents. Because he had to go to work early in the morning, Daddy went to bed after Ed Sullivan, and Mommy left after the Smothers Brothers. I lasted through the end of Mission Impossible and then turned off the downstairs TV, realizing TV had lessened my obsession with romantic thoughts of my beloved bishop. I went to my room, which had a portable TV. I watched the local 11 o'clock news, then turned it off and went to sleep. Monday was uneventful, but Tuesday's call from Stephen lifted me higher than a New York skyscraper. He had written part of his schedule on a new calendar, put it away, and forgotten about it. While rambling through his briefcase, he found that calendar and noticed he had church business in Columbus and Akron Friday and Saturday of this week. It had completely slipped his mind. To make matters worse, the church business was immensely vital to the future of the AAMU denomination. As he scrambled to make arrangements to be in those cities, it became perfectly clear it might be possible for us to see each other. He set it up so he would preach in Akron on Sunday, hoping I could join him there that day. Altogether, He will have spent Sunday through Tuesday in St. Louis, Wednesday and Thursday in Louisville, Friday in Columbus, plus Saturday and Sunday in Akron. I asked Mommy if Stephen could sleep here Sunday and Monday night and leave Tuesday afternoon for Philadelphia. Mommy gave the go-ahead, and all was well with my world. I planned to drive to Akron early Sunday morning, attend service at the Wesley Christian AAMU Church, dine with him and possibly others there, and transport Stephen to Youngstown that evening in my little car